Hey guys, welcome back to the campfire. I have another awesome story to share with you tonight. So when I was a kid, I used to love reading this book called Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, which is this really, frankly, not kid-friendly, scary story book that's marketed for kids, but it's like terrifying. The stories in there are like, they kept me up at night. I mean, they were really disturbing stories. They were fictional, but they rocked me as a kid. And when I read the story I'm going to share with you tonight, it just really brought me back to that feeling I got when I used to read those stories as a child. This story tonight feels like it belongs in that book, except tonight's story is not fiction like the book was. This is a true story. This story took place in Malaysia in the 1970s, and even though when you first hear it, it's almost going to sound like urban legend, when you get to the end of the story, so the end of this episode, I will share the very famous photograph that is associated with the story and is frankly the reason people continue to talk about the story, because this photograph sort of makes it impossible for this to be an urban legend. I'll show you that photograph. It's going to horrify you, and then you can be the judge of what you think really happened. But before we get into tonight's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right campfire, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to water the like button's plants the next time they go away for a long weekend. But instead of using water, use bleach. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into tonight's story. One summer night in the 1970s, a young woman named Hannah was sitting next to her husband at a blackjack table inside of the Genting Highlands Casino, which was this huge casino in central Malaysia. The room they were in was bright, it was loud, there was people everywhere, there's cigarette smoke hovering in the air, lots of drinking and chatting and laughing and gambling. And so as Hannah is sitting in this environment, she was doing her best not to let her nerves get the best of her, but she couldn't help it. I mean, she was really feeling anxious because her husband had just bet all their chips on this one hand. So her husband had been dealt his 2 cards, and they totaled 19, which was basically good, because in blackjack, you're trying to get to 21. You want your cards in total to equal 21, but you don't want to go over, or you bust, you lose. And so 19 is pretty good, but you're playing really against the dealer. And so basically it's between you and the dealer, who can get closest to 21 without going over. So the dealer had 2 cards, one was face up and one was face down. The face up card was a 10, and so Hannah is anxiously waiting to see this other card flipped over, just praying it's not a 10, because that would give him 20, and that would beat, her husband's 19, and they would lose. And so the dealer, he flips over this other card, and it's a 4. So now he's got 14, and so that's good. It means Hannah and her husband, they're still in the lead here. But the dealer will keep on hitting, so adding more cards to the pile here, adding to their total score, until they either hit 17 at least, or until they beat you, or until they bust. So they're going to keep on drawing more cards. And so the dealer draws another card, he puts it face down, and it's an 8. And so now collectively, the dealer has 22, they've gone over 21, they've busted, and Hannah and her husband have won. And so Hannah, she turns to her husband and she's overjoyed. I mean, they've just gambled all their money and they've won. I mean, this is a huge win. And Hannah and her husband, they didn't really come for money here. I mean, they're very modest people. They had saved up money for this trip. They had really wanted to come to this casino for a long time. And now it was like their luck was just incredible. They're having this unbelievable run. They had won a bunch of money beforehand, and now they had just won this hand and they doubled their money. Like, this is incredible. And so at this point, Hannah and her husband, they take all their chips, they leave the blackjack table. Everyone's like so excited for them, like the energy is awesome. And so Hannah and her husband, they make their way over to the cashier and they cash all their chips. They get all this cash. And Hannah's talking to her husband like, this is awesome. Like, we were gonna have to drive home tonight. let's get a room here. Let's use some of this money and like stay at the lavish hotel they have. Maybe we can go back to the casino tomorrow. Let's make a vacation out of this. But after cashing all their chips, Hannah's husband, he didn't seem too inclined to go spend the money on a hotel room or a restaurant or whatever. He told her, he's like, I don't know, like I feel really lucky, like I'm on a roll here. I don't want to just like be done. I think I should go play slots and try to win a little bit more money. I think we can win more money. And Hannah's like, are you crazy? Like, this is the most money we've ever won ever. Like, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity. If we stay and continue to gamble, we're just gonna lose the money. Like, let's take the win. Let's get the hotel room. Let's just do that. But Hannah's husband, he was not having it, and he literally just took their money and was like, no, I'm gonna go do slots now. And he walked over to a slot machine. And Hannah's like, oh my God. She follows her husband over to the slot machine, and before long, he's playing the slots, and it's not going well, and Hannah's trying to convince him to stop, but he wouldn't have it, and he was so committed, he just kept going, and wouldn't you know it, after 2 hours of this, all the money was gone. Well, actually, it was not entirely all gone. He still had a little bit of money that they had intentionally set aside just to cover the hotel, because they needed a place to stay that night, and they had stayed later at the casino. And so literally they are down to just enough to stay in the hotel. And so at this point, Hannah, she's already accepted that they've lost all their winnings. And she's telling her husband, like, please, let's just walk away. Let's use this money. Let's just stay in the hotel. It is what it is. And they're about to leave when her husband's like, one more, turns around, puts it in the slot machine, pulls the lever, lose. Now they literally have no money. They have actually no more money. They can't get a hotel. It's the middle of the night, late. They have nowhere to stay. And now they have to drive home. And the drive is going to be awful. Like, Hannah is furious with her husband. Her husband feels like, oh, it's just bad luck. It's not my fault. But Hannah's like, it is your fault. You should have left. So it's just this awful, awful exit from the casino. Like, this is about to be the worst ride home ever. About 20 minutes later, Hannah was sitting in the passenger seat and her husband was driving, and they're cruising down this road. It's the middle of the night. They've passed no cars as they're driving. They're in this desolate stretch on their way back to their home. And, you know, as expected, this has been a treacherous ride so far. They fought at the beginning, and now they're not talking. And so they're driving along, and Hannah's just looking out the window at all the trees. It's very jungly and swampy off to the side on either side of the road, and they're driving along. And at some point, as Hannah is just desperate to get home, she just wants to go to bed. She doesn't even care about the money at this point. She just literally wants to get in her bed. They're driving along when the car starts to sputter, like it's running out of gas. And immediately Hannah looks over at her husband like, are you kidding me? And her husband's looking over at her like, knowing that he's gonna bring even more wrath down on himself from his wife. And he's just like, I'm sorry, like I didn't know it was that low. Like I didn't know the tank was that low. And before long, he had to pull over on the side of the road because their car was out of gas. Like they couldn't go any farther. And so Hannah, as the car has come to a stop on the side of the road, she just looks at her husband and she's like, wow, like this night really couldn't get any worse. Like, are you kidding me? We are stranded in the middle of nowhere. We got no money. What are we gonna do? And so Hannah's husband, you know, he obviously knew this was not good. Like he knows he's the one that was supposed to put gas in the car and he didn't. You know, he's sort of been the architect behind this whole disaster of a night here with his decision to keep on gambling. And so he just says to Hannah, look, you stay here, just stay in the car. I have a gas can. I'll just walk to the nearest gas station. I'll get some gas. I'll bring it back. I'll fill it up. We'll be home soon. We can't be that far away anyways. Like it can't be that far away. So just stay here. I'll go get gas. And so Hannah's like, okay, fine. Go get gas. And so Hannah just stays in the car and her husband gets out. He goes in the back of the car. He gets the gas can. And then before long, Hannah watches as her husband walks ahead of the car and disappears into the darkness. BetterHelp is the paid partner of today's video. Are you so used to keeping everyone else comfortable that you barely notice how often you abandon yourself in the process? I think a lot of us have been there. You get so used to putting everyone else first that taking care of yourself almost starts to feel selfish. And after a while, putting other people first stops feeling like a choice. Until one day, you realize you can't remember the last time a decision genuinely felt like your own.
And the strange thing about constantly managing other people's comfort is that slowly you lose touch with your own. And this is where therapy can help you understand where those patterns come from. And it can help you rebuild trust in your own voice, your own instincts, and the parts of yourself that get pushed aside just to keep everybody else comfortable. BetterHelp makes starting therapy easier. Take the quiz and get matched with a credentialed therapist quickly. BetterHelp has served over 6 million people globally. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallin and get 10% off your first month of therapy.
And so after Hannah's husband has walked off, she knows it's going to be at least, 30, 40 minutes, before he gets gas and comes back. And, she's exhausted. And so she makes sure all the doors are locked, and then she leans back her seat and she just tries to go to sleep. And pretty quickly she does doze off. But then at some point, maybe 5-10 minutes later, she just kind of inexplicably wakes up. There was no reason why she woke up. She just opened her eyes and she, for a second was a little bit disoriented. When you fall asleep for a few minutes like that, you'll kind of wake up like, what just happened? She's disoriented and she remembered, oh, that's right. We had this horrible night, the casino went horribly. We ran out of gas. Oh, that's right. Like I'm living out this nightmare. Okay, now I know where I am. And so after getting her bearings, Hannah just rolled over in her seat and tried to go back to sleep. But this time, after closing her eyes, after just a few seconds, she heard this loud thumping noise on the roof of the car. And it was loud enough that she opened her eyes back up and, there's no sunroof or anything, so she couldn't see what it was. And it was so dark outside and there were no streetlights out there that she couldn't just look out the window and see what it was. But she knew her husband could not possibly be back yet. And even if he was, why would he be banging on the roof? But then she remembered they had parked right next to this jungly, swampy area, just right off the side of the road. And, there were probably some low-hanging branches, and it was entirely possible that the wind had caused a branch to just bang against the roof of the car. And so that's what she assumed it was, and after realizing that, she just got comfortable again and closed her eyes. But then a few seconds later, she heard another thump on the roof of the car. And again, she instinctively looked out the window and she's sort of like trying to figure out what it is, but she can't see anything. There's no sign of her husband walking up the road. There's nothing. And so again, she just tells herself, okay, again, it's just got to be this branch. But then after hearing it a second time, the thumping sound, it began to sort of persist. It's not super loud, but it's pretty consistent. It's like a thumping sound on the roof of the car. And it did basically sound like a branch hitting the roof, but it's just just a nuisance. And more than anything, she's just frustrated because it's loud enough that she's not going to be able to sleep. And so she's not frightened by it. She's a little bit, unnerved by it perhaps because it's the middle of the night. She's all alone. But for the most part, she's just like, oh, great. Now I can't sleep. And so she's just sitting in her car and the thumping is continuing and she's just staring straight ahead. And she knew, she was sort of being a little cowardly. She figured I probably should just get out and just confirm this really is a branch. But there was just some part of her that's like, I am in the middle of nowhere. It's the middle of the night. It's a little bit creepy, so I'm not going to do that. So she's just looking straight ahead, really waiting for her husband. And so thump, thump, thump. She's just looking straight ahead. And then a little while later, she doesn't see her husband, but she sees headlights appear that are coming in her direction. And to this point, she hadn't seen a single other car since they had been on this road, basically, or at least since they had pulled over, because they were out of gas. She had not seen another car. And so here comes a car approaching and she's thinking, oh, it's got to be my husband. He must have found someone who, heard about our story and he's got gas and they're just giving him a ride up here to come drop him off. He's going to fill up the car. We're going to be out of here in a second. Thank goodness. And so Hannah, she doesn't get out of the car. She just sits there, waiting for this car to approach. And the car, as it gets closer and closer, it appears to slow down. And it's too dark to see, who's in the car, whether it's her husband or not. But this car is clearly slowing down. It appears to recognize her car and where she is. And she's expecting at any point this car is going to fully stop and her husband's going to get out. And so she's just waiting and the car is getting closer and it's slowing down. But then sort of inexplicably, right as this car is very close to her car, the car just peels out and speeds down the road, just away from her as fast as they could go, and then they're gone. And so immediately Hannah's like, okay, one, clearly not my husband, so that's disappointing. But two, like, what was that? why did they do that? Why did they slow down and speed up like that? And the whole time this is going on, it's just constant thumping on the roof of her car, which by now she's almost zoned out, but it's persisting. And so at this point, Hannah went from being basically annoyed with the situation to now starting to feel a little bit freaked out. I mean, her husband's still not back. It's been, at this point, kind of a while since he left, and she doesn't really know how far the nearest gas station's going to be or how long it's going to take him, but she's starting to think, like, it should be soon. He should be getting back here. And this weirdness with the car speeding off like that wasn't normal. And then also there was just this constant thumping on the roof of her car. And she, again, had told herself it was a branch, but she's starting to wonder, like, is it? But, like, what else could it be? And so now Hannah is sitting here staring out, into the darkness in front of her, like desperately wishing her husband would show up like any second here. Like, please, like, come out of the darkness and rescue me, because this is getting really uncomfortable. But time kept on ticking on, and her husband didn't show up, and the thumping continued, and no other cars came through. And so Hannah slowly began to worry that maybe her husband got lost. Like, maybe he's not able to find where she is. Is she just like stranded out here? Like, what's going on? And so as Hannah is sort of beginning to spiral, like as her thoughts are beginning to spiral and she's getting more and more worried, she started to give half a thought to leaving the car and forget about what's happening with the roof. Like, I'm gonna go find my husband. Like, she thought about going and looking for him, but then she thought, like, oh, what's gonna happen is I'm gonna get out, I'm gonna go look for him, and we're gonna like pass each other in the dark. He's not gonna know I'm looking for him, I'm not gonna find him, and now he's gonna be back at the car and I'm missing. And so I'm just gonna create more problems. And so she tells herself that really the only thing she can do that's responsible is just stay put. And so there she stays. And the thumping continues. And her husband continues not to show up. And like the time as it's going by, it's like agonizingly slow. And now she's getting really worked up that, like, she's being watched or something. Like, she's really starting to get paranoid. When all of a sudden, down the road, she sees something. And it's really a huge relief when she sees it at first. She sees more headlights. And at first she's thinking, oh, thank goodness, this has got to be my husband. Like, this is a car coming up the road. He's going to be in there this time. He's going to get out of here. He's got the gas. We're going to get out of here. But as the headlights appeared over the horizon coming towards her, she realized it was not an ordinary car. It was not just headlights. There were also lights on top of this vehicle. It was a police car. And so this police car is cruising down the road, and, Hannah's thinking, well, it could still be my husband. Maybe he got a ride from the police. But then she's thinking, oh my goodness, like, has something happened to him? Are they coming to tell me that something's happened to my husband? Like she's having all these terrible thoughts. And so this police car, they come to a stop on the other side of the road. And at first, Hannah is just like unsure what she should even be doing. Like, should she get out to greet them? Should she wait here? But as she's just staring across the road at the two officers that are in this vehicle, and she doesn't see her husband in there, she sees the officer that's closest to her, the driver. He gets out of the car and he stands on the road, and then he draws his pistol and he aims it at her. Like, he's aiming the gun at her and the car she's in. And she's like, what is going on here? And so she just freezes, doesn't say or do anything. And the other officer in the passenger side, so on the far side of the car, he gets out of the cruiser as well, but he's got a megaphone in his hand. And so through this megaphone, he kind of leans out and he barks 3 orders to Hannah. The first order is get out of the car. The second order is come over to our car. And the third order is don't look back. And so at this point, Hannah realized that the first officer who stepped out of the car with the gun, he wasn't aiming at her. He was aiming at the roof of her car. That's where his gun was pointed right now. And so between that and the fact that she's been listening to this thumping sound for the last 45 minutes, assuming it was a branch, she's now realizing there's no way it's a branch. Like, she sort of sensed it couldn't be, like it had to be something else, but she had sort of convinced herself, oh, it's a tree branch. Now she knows it's not. And so she had no idea what could possibly be on the roof of her car. But she knew whatever it was, it had to be bad. And so Hannah all she wants to do is get out of this car and go over there. She doesn't want to be here anymore. I mean, this whole thing has been awful, and now she's terrified, but she's like frozen. Like, what does she do? Like, what's going on? But again, the officer with the bullhorn comes across and says, hey, get out of the car, come over to us, and don't look back. Right now, get up, go. And so Hannah is like, I just gotta go. And so she opens her door, and as fast as she can, she gets out, she doesn't look back, she banks around the car, and across the street she goes, and the whole time she's thinking, oh, something's gonna grab me, but she gets to the cop car, she throws open the door, and she jumps inside, and at first, she adheres to their orders. She doesn't look back, as they told her to. She didn't look back. But now that she's like safely inside the cop car, there's, two officers protecting her, one with a gun drawn, pointed at her car, she couldn't help herself. She had to see what was on the roof of her car. So she went over to the window and she looked. And as soon as she saw what was on the roof of her car, she just starts screaming. And at the same time, the officer, who was still standing out there with his gun drawn, he begins just firing nonstop at her car. And so Hannah, she screams, she ducks down behind the door. She can't see anything. There's just this constant barrage of gunfire, blasting the car and whatever was on the roof of the car. And then, Hannah, she's tucked down and she's thinking, this is a nightmare. Like, how is this real? She hears the sound of that officer who was shooting and the other officer. They get out of the car. She hears them run across the street towards her car. The shooting kind of stops, and it's just like the shuffling of feet. And then she hears this like loud thumping sound as something really heavy like slammed into the pavement. And then she heard the sound of something big like running off into the jungle, into the tree line, like trees just, moving all around. And then there's just silence. And then a moment later, she hears the sound of the officers coming back across the street. She's still tucked down. She can't look out the window. She just hears the sound of their footsteps. It's definitely them. And as they're getting closer, she can hear them like trying to make sense of what they just saw. Like they don't even know what they just saw. And at some point, Hannah's door opens up. And on the other side, it's the officer who had the megaphone. And he just looks ashen-faced. He's very shaken up. And he begins to try to explain what he's just seen, but it's clear he can't even describe it. And as he's trying to do it, like Hannah, she's crying, she's so upset, and she just tells him, like, don't even tell me. Like, I saw it too. When Hannah did look back, so when she went against the police's orders and she looked out the window back at her car, what she saw at first, like, didn't even compute. She saw that clearly there was no branch striking the roof of her car. What she saw was a woman. There was a woman on the roof of her car. This woman is like dirty and her hair is matted and it was like kind of covering like the front of her head. Like she's just like weirdly positioned on the roof of the car. Like that clearly was what was making the banging sound for the 45 minutes or so that she was over there. And so that alone is like horrific. But then in this instant that Hannah had looked over and seen this woman, the woman, she kind of appeared to be eating something. Like that was the gesticulation that she was doing. It sort of looked like she was eating something. And she looked up for a second as Hannah is staring across the road and her matted hair kind of parted. And the woman is looking right at Hannah and there's blood all over her mouth and her chin. And then Hannah saw what she was eating, and that's the thing that made her start screaming and prompted the police to start shooting. The woman was chewing on Hannah's husband's severed head. And so as soon as the police open fire, this cannibal woman lets go of the head and it falls to the pavement and it makes that loud thumping sound that Hannah would recall hearing as she's crouched down, wishing this was some nightmare. And then this woman, she leaps off the roof of the car, under a hail of gunfire. She lands on all fours, and like an animal, she gallops into the tree line and vanishes. And so the two officers, they ran across the street after her, but quickly realized, like, she was gone. And so they called for backup. Backup arrives, and all these officers go out into the jungle, and they can't find this woman. She's gone. But they would find the rest of the body. So the rest of the husband's body was actually not far from the vehicle. It was just laying out on the side of the road, sort of tucked up against the tree line. And so today, because this woman was never caught, there's not really a good explanation of what actually happened. The only evidence we have is that obviously Hana's husband died. We have his body, he was decapitated. We have, strong witness testimony, not just from Hana, but from these two police officers, and in some ways the backup officers that also showed up, but they were there sort of after the fact. But there's also one other piece of evidence that really is the sole reason in some ways that this story lives on and that we're still talking about it today. And it's because it's far and away the most compelling piece of evidence we have that this really happened the way Hana and the officer said. It is this picture of the woman on the roof of the car moments before the police opened fire. All right, thank you all so much for joining me tonight at the campfire. And if you enjoyed this, remember, we actually have a whole playlist of campfire episodes that are ready for you to binge right now. If you want to do that, go ahead and click right here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.
On the morning of June 30th, 1971, a Soviet recovery team was flying in a fleet of military helicopters over the flat, dusty steppes of Kazakhstan, and they were looking out the windows, scanning the barren horizon for a returning spacecraft. Now, normally when a descent capsule lands, the heavy winds on the steppe catch the massive parachute and drag the metal ship across the dirt until the crew can manually release the lines. But as the helicopters spotted the blackened, scorched bell shape of the Soyuz capsule resting on the ground, it was sitting completely upright, and the parachute was just draped over the dirt perfectly still. So the lead commander signaled his pilot to land, and he jumped out into the thick brush running toward the capsule. And he reached the metal hull, expecting to hear the crew knocking from the inside, waiting to be let out. But there was only silence. And the commander figured that after 22 days in zero gravity, the sudden, crushing weight of Earth's atmosphere was probably just making the crew dizzy. So there had to be a reasonable explanation. They were just too exhausted to move. So he grabbed a heavy wrench from his belt, and he torqued the locking mechanism on the external hatch, and he pulled the heavy door open. Inside, the three astronauts were sitting perfectly upright in their custom-molded seats, and their eyes were closed and their faces were completely relaxed as if they were just taking a nap. And a medic climbed up onto the edge of the hatch, leaning in to check the pulse of the mission commander. And as his fingers pressed against the man's neck, the skin was completely cold. And as the medic pulled his hand back, he watched a single drop of dark blood roll out of the astronaut's left ear and fall onto the shoulder of his tracksuit. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload every single week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's house, replace all of their regular coffee with decaf, and then hide their favorite mug. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications. Okay, let's get into today's story. Now, in the spring of 1971, the Soviet Union was dealing with a massive shift in their space program. And that was because the Americans had already successfully landed on the moon 2 years prior. So the Soviet leadership decided they were not going to race for the moon anymore. And instead, they were going to do something no one else had ever done. They were going to build a house in the stars. And they launched Salyut-1, which was the first ever functional space station in human history. But launching the station was only half the battle. They needed to send a crew up there to live inside of it. And the men chosen for this historic mission were originally just part of a backup crew. The mission commander was a 43-year-old fighter pilot named Georgy Dobrovolsky, and he was a man who grew up in extreme poverty during the war, and he had worked his way up through the military ranks with absolute precision. And sitting next to him was a 35-year-old flight engineer named Vladislav Volkov. And Vladislav was incredibly charismatic. He was a brilliant engineer, and he had already been to space once before. And rounding out the crew was 37-year-old Viktor Patsayev, who was a quiet, highly meticulous test engineer. And these three men were never supposed to be the prime crew for this flight. They were strictly the backups. But just days before the launch, the prime crew was doing their final medical checks. And the military doctors found a dark shadow on the X-ray of one of the prime crew members. And they thought it was a spot of tuberculosis. You have to pack your things. What is going on? There is a spot on your lung. You are grounded. And because the crew trained as a single inseparable unit, the entire prime crew was immediately pulled from the flight. And Georgy, Vladislav, and Victor were suddenly told that they were going to space. And because they were the backups, they had not run the full simulations in the capsule for weeks. So for 3 straight days, they locked themselves inside a physical mock-up of the Soyuz spacecraft. And they flipped switches, and they ran emergency drills, and they barely slept. And Georgie kept telling his men that they had to be absolutely perfect, because the entire world was watching them. And so, on June 6, 1971, the 3 men walked out to the massive launch pad, and they climbed into the top of the rocket. Now, the spacecraft they were flying in was called the Soyuz, and the Soyuz was an engineering marvel, but it was incredibly cramped inside. The descent module, which was the only part of the ship that actually returned to Earth, was basically a tiny metal bell that was just over 7 feet wide. And to fit 3 fully grown men inside this tiny space, the Soviet engineers had to make a very specific compromise. Because if the men wore heavy, pressurized spacesuits, they simply would not fit in the seats, and they wouldn't be able to reach the control panels. So the engineers decided that the crew would fly in standard, lightweight tracksuits. And this meant that if the cabin ever lost pressure, the men would have absolutely no backup oxygen. But the engineers believed the Soyuz was so advanced and so reliable that a depressurization event was basically impossible. And the launch went flawlessly. The rocket tore through the atmosphere and the Soyuz entered orbit. And a few days later, they successfully docked with the Salyut 1 space station. And when they opened the hatch and floated inside, they made history. Because they were the first human beings to ever board a research station in orbit. And for the next 22 days, the 3 men lived in space. They ran scientific experiments, they observed the stars, and they tested how the human body reacts to long-term zero gravity. And it was incredibly difficult work. The station was loud, it smelled like metallic ozone, and the zero gravity was causing their muscles to atrophy. So they had to run on a massive treadmill that was bolted to the floor. But every time they ran, the vibrations would shake the entire station, making it hard for the others to work. And eating in space was a massive challenge. They had to squeeze pureed meat and vegetables out of small metal tubes, just like toothpaste. And the air circulation system on the station was constantly droning in the background, making it very hard to sleep. And because there is no up or down in zero gravity, Victor found himself constantly disoriented, feeling like he was falling every time he closed his eyes. But despite the physical toll, they were incredibly productive. They took hundreds of photographs of the Earth's surface, and they grew small plants in a tiny, custom-built greenhouse to see if agriculture was possible in orbit. And on day 11, a thick, acrid smoke suddenly started pouring out of an electrical panel near the rear of the station, and the alarms started blaring. And Georgie immediately floated over to the communication console. "We have a fire. Do you need to evacuate?" "No, we are shutting down the main power." And they managed to isolate the burning cables and put the fire out. And ground control offered to bring them home early, but all 3 men refused. Because they wanted to finish the mission, and they wanted to break the world record for the longest time spent in space. So they stayed. And by June 29th, they had been in space for 22 days, completely shattering the previous record. And it was time to come home. And before they could leave the station, they had to transfer all of their film canisters and logbooks into the tiny descent module. And every single item had to be strapped down perfectly. Because if a loose pen or a clipboard floated around during the violent shaking of re-entry, it could smash into a control panel and cause a short circuit. So they spent hours meticulously packing the cabin. And then they floated through the narrow tunnel connecting the station to their ship. And they pulled the heavy circular hatch closed, spinning the locking wheel until it clicked into place. And they ran a full pressure check to make sure the seal was completely airtight and the dials held steady. There were absolutely no leaks. Now, the Soyuz is made of 3 distinct sections. There is a large orbital module at the top, the descent module in the middle, where the crew sits, and the service module at the bottom, which holds the engines. And to return to Earth, the ship has to fire its engines to slow down, and then the top and bottom sections have to be blown off using explosive bolts. And this leaves just the middle descent module to plunge through the atmosphere. So Georgie, Vladislav, and Victor strapped themselves into their seats, and they put on their communication headsets, and they fired the main retro rockets, and the ship began to slow down, dropping out of orbit. And at an altitude of exactly 168 kilometers above the Earth, the automated sequencer sent an electrical charge to the explosive bolts. And the bolts detonated violently, severing the top and bottom modules away from the crew cabin. And right as the bolts fired, a sudden, sharp hissing sound echoed inside the small cabin. And Georgie immediately turned his head toward the floor, looking around the cramped space. but the sound was incredibly loud, like a high-pressure air hose being disconnected. Meanwhile, back on Earth, the men in the Soviet Ground Control Center were sitting at their consoles, drinking coffee, and watching the telemetry data scroll across their screens. And they heard a brief burst of static over the radio, and then the channel went completely silent. But the flight director didn't even flinch, because the ground controllers were wrong about their most basic assumption. They assumed that the silence on the radio was just the standard plasma blackout. Because when a spacecraft hits the upper atmosphere, it compresses the air in front of it so intensely that it creates a sheath of superheated plasma around the hull. And this plasma completely blocks all radio waves. So ground control just assumed that the crew was experiencing a normal bumpy ride through the atmosphere. They had absolutely no idea that their astronauts were already dead before the ship even began to heat up. And the controllers just waited. And a few minutes later, the radar stations on the ground picked up a solid signal. The capsule was falling right on target. And as the capsule dropped lower, the automated barometric sensors triggered the parachute sequence. And a massive parachute deployed, slowing the capsule down to a gentle drift. And the controllers cheered. And as the capsule neared the dirt, small retro rockets on the bottom of the hull fired automatically, cushioning the impact. It was a completely flawless textbook landing. The automated systems had worked perfectly. And this brings us right back to the Kazakh steppes. The helicopters land in the dirt. The recovery team runs up to the blackened capsule. They see the parachute laying still in the dirt. And the commander knocks on the metal hull. And when nobody answers, he assumes they are just exhausted from the gravity. So he opens the hatch. And he sees the three men sitting in their seats, eyes closed. And the medic climbs up, checks Georgie's pulse, feels his cold skin, and sees the single drop of dark blood rolling from his ear. And the medic immediately yells for help. And the recovery team scrambles. They unbuckle the limp bodies of the three astronauts, and they pull them out of the capsule, laying them side by side on the dusty ground. And as the doctors laid the three men in the dirt, the scene was incredibly chaotic. The helicopter blades were still spinning, kicking up massive clouds of brown dust. And the medics were shouting over the roar of the engines, demanding oxygen tanks and defibrillators. And they cut open the thick fabric of the astronauts' tracksuits, exposing their pale chests. And they started rhythmic compressions, pushing down with all their body weight, trying to force the stagnant blood to circulate. And they kept checking the pupils of the astronauts with small flashlights, looking for any sign of a response to the light. But their eyes remained fixed and dilated. And one of the lead doctors actually collapsed from exhaustion after doing CPR for 20 straight minutes, and another medic immediately had to take his place. And they refused to stop until a senior military officer finally walked over and ordered them to stand down, realizing that the men had been dead for a very long time. And the doctors are standing there in total disbelief, because nothing about the scene makes any sense. The capsule is not crushed. There are no scorch marks on the inside of the cabin. There is no smell of smoke or toxic gas. And when the engineers look at the life support panel, they see that the oxygen tanks are completely full. So every single piece of evidence points to a perfect flight. The spacecraft did exactly what it was supposed to do. There was no obvious mechanical failure. And it wasn't until the capsule was loaded onto a military transport and taken back to a secure hangar in Moscow that the investigators finally found the answer. They pulled the black box data recorder from the ship, and they began listening to the cockpit audio and reviewing the pressure logs. And if you recall that sudden, sharp hissing sound that echoed inside the cabin right after the explosive bolts fired, that hiss was the sound of a mechanical pressure equalization valve being accidentally jarred open by the violent shockwave of the exploding bolts. Now, this valve was located right under Georgie's seat, and it was designed to open automatically, but only when the capsule was extremely close to the ground, so it could let fresh air into the cabin before the crew opened the hatch. And the opening of this valve was no bigger than a small coin. But at an altitude of 168 kilometers, a hole the size of a coin is an absolute death sentence. Because the men were wearing tracksuits instead of pressurized spacesuits, they had no personal air supply. The cabin pressure was their only protection. Based on the recovered telemetry data, here is a reconstruction of the final seconds inside the Soyuz capsule. The explosive bolts fire, jarring the capsule. The valve snaps open. And instantly, the pressurized oxygen inside the cabin rushes toward the vacuum of space, screaming through the tiny hole under the seat. And the pressure drop is so violent and so rapid that the air inside the astronauts' lungs is forcefully sucked out of their bodies. And Georgie realizes what is happening. He hears the hiss under his seat, so he quickly unbuckles his heavy harness. And he leans down frantically, reaching in the dark, trying to find the tiny hole so he can plug it with his finger. But the sound of the escaping air is completely deafening, and without oxygen, his brain begins shutting down almost immediately, and his movements become sluggish and uncoordinated. And within 30 seconds, he loses the ability to control his hands. And the other two men are strapped in their seats, staring helplessly as the cabin goes completely silent. And by the 40-second mark, the pressure inside the cabin hits absolute zero. And the three men fall unconscious, their bodies completely starved of oxygen, causing small blood vessels in their ears and noses to rupture. And less than a minute after the bolts fired, the men were dead. And the heavily automated Soyuz spacecraft, completely unaware that the men inside of it had already perished, just continued its programming. It aligned itself perfectly. It hit the atmosphere. It deployed its parachutes. And it flew itself perfectly back to Earth, carrying a crew that had died in the silence of space. Georgy Dobrovolsky, Vladislav Volkov, and Viktor Patsayev were brought back to Moscow, where they were given a massive state funeral. And their ashes were interred in the Kremlin Wall necropolis. And to this day, they remain the first and only human beings in history to have ever died above the Kármán line in the true vacuum of space. And their deaths fundamentally changed the rules of space exploration, ensuring that no astronaut would ever launch or return in a Soyuz spacecraft without wearing a fully pressurized survival suit. And while the cold, silent vacuum of space holds its own dark secrets, sometimes the Earth beneath our feet hides something even older and far more powerful, quietly burning away in the dark. In May of 1972, a senior analytical chemist named Henri was sitting inside a brightly lit, completely sterile laboratory at the Pierre-Alaut nuclear fuel processing plant in southeastern France. And Henri had a job that required absolute, unforgiving physical precision. Because this sprawling, highly secure industrial facility was directly responsible for enriching uranium for both the French military weapons program and their civilian power grid. So every single ounce of radioactive material that came through their heavy steel security doors had to be meticulously accounted for on a daily basis. And on this particular Tuesday afternoon, Henri was running a completely routine standard quality control check. A massive new shipment of raw uranium ore had just arrived on heavy cargo ships from a French-operated mining site in the West African nation of Gabon. And the raw dirt had already been chemically milled down into a thick, heavily processed mustard yellow powder known as yellow cake. So Henri put on his thick rubber protective gloves, took a tiny physical sample of this yellow powder from a metal drum, and walked it over to his brightly lit testing station. Now, Henri was operating a massive, highly complex scientific machine called a mass spectrometer. And this machine was incredibly sensitive, specifically designed to use magnetic fields to weigh individual atoms in a vacuum. And Henri was looking for a very specific isotopic ratio, because in nature, raw uranium comes in a few different variations. But the most important one for nuclear reactions is uranium-235. And the absolute rule of physical science is that naturally occurring uranium always contains exactly 0.720% uranium-235. And this specific percentage is an absolute universal constant. It does not matter where you find the uranium. If it is mined deep underground in the freezing mountains of Canada, or dug up in the dry deserts of Australia, or even found inside a rocky meteorite that crashed to Earth from deep space, the isotopic concentration will always read exactly 0.720. It never fluctuates. So Henri carefully loaded his tiny yellow cake sample from the Gabon shipment into the heavy steel vacuum chamber of the spectrometer. And he pushed a sequence of mechanical buttons on his heavy metal console to begin the high-voltage ionization process. And the large machine hummed to life, pulling a total atmospheric vacuum inside the sealed chamber. And a few minutes later, the mechanical printer resting on the metal desk began to clatter loudly. It spit out a thin white strip of paper covered in a long column of typed numbers detailing the exact isotopic breakdown of the African dirt. But as Henri pulled the paper from the mechanical slot and dragged his pen down the column of numbers, his hand stopped. Because the printout for the uranium-235 concentration did not say 0.720%. It said 0.717%. And Henri just stared at the wet ink on the thin paper. Because this kind of numerical discrepancy was not just a clerical error, it was a complete physical impossibility. A missing fraction of 0.003% might sound completely microscopic and totally irrelevant to an average person, but to a highly trained nuclear chemist, that specific missing fraction means only one thing. It means the heavy uranium has already been burned and depleted inside a functioning nuclear reactor. So Henri immediately assumed his sensitive equipment was malfunctioning, and he spent the next 4 hours tearing his entire testing workstation apart. He opened the heavy metal casing of the spectrometer and cleaned the internal ionization chamber with absolute care, wiping away any microscopic dust. He manually recalibrated the magnetic sensors using specialized heavy tools. He then ran a fresh control sample of uranium from a known local French mine just to check the machine's accuracy. And the printer clattered again, and the machine correctly spit out exactly 0.720. But when Henri took another physical sample of the yellow cake from the massive Gabon shipment and ran it through the freshly cleaned machine, the result came back exactly the same. The printer typed out 0.717%. And Henri ran the long test again. And the printed result was exactly the same. The raw uranium was definitively missing its most critical, highly volatile isotope. And Henri walked across the room, picked up his heavy rotary phone, and dialed the direct secure line to his department supervisor. "We have a severe contamination issue with the new African shipment. Did you run the full diagnostics on the spectrometer?" "I rebuilt the entire sensor array. The machine is completely fine. The U-235 is absolutely depleted." And within a few hours of that phone call, the entire administrative wing of the French Atomic Energy Commission was placed into a state of absolute strict lockdown, because the top government officials were completely wrong about their most basic assumption regarding this strange data. They did not look at the missing fraction as a scientific anomaly or a natural curiosity. They were operating under the strict, absolute belief that a massive amount of highly dangerous weapons-grade nuclear material had been stolen right out from under them by a highly organized group. Now, in 1972, the global geopolitical climate was incredibly tense, and the international intelligence community was highly paranoid about rogue nations or black market syndicates getting their hands on the raw materials needed to secretly build an atomic bomb. And the senior intelligence officials in Paris locked themselves in a secure room and quickly did the math on the Oklo mine shipment. Because the African mine had been actively operating for years, pulling thousands of tons of heavy ore out of the deep dirt, and if every single ton of that exported dirt was secretly missing 0.003% of its highly radioactive isotopes, the total amount of missing highly concentrated uranium added up to roughly 400 pounds. And 400 pounds of pure enriched uranium-235 was more than enough raw material to build half a dozen highly destructive nuclear weapons. And the French government realized they had a massive international security crisis actively unfolding on their hands. So, they immediately deployed a large team of elite military investigators, forensic accountants, and senior nuclear physicists to aggressively trace the uranium backward. Their primary objective was to follow the complex supply chain step by step, from the sterile laboratory in southeastern France all the way back to the deep dirt in Africa, and find exactly where the massive leak was happening. And the investigators started their intense search at the massive shipping port of Le Havre on the northern coast of France. And they walked the heavy concrete docks where the massive ocean cargo ships from Africa had unloaded the heavy steel drums of yellowcake. They aggressively audited every single shipping manifest from the past 3 years. They brought the dock workers and the heavy crane operators into small, windowless rooms and interviewed them aggressively, checking for any unauthorized access to the deep cargo holds. But the heavy metal security seals on the shipping drums were completely intact. There was absolutely no sign of physical tampering on any of the massive boats. So the massive investigation moved overseas. A large team of French military authorities flew down to the nation of Gabon carrying heavy metal briefcases full of financial ledgers. And they rode heavily armored trains deep into the dense, incredibly humid jungle to reach the remote Oklo mining settlement. And the Oklo mine was an absolutely massive, sprawling open-pit operation carved directly into the red earth. And hundreds of local miners worked around the clock in the intense, suffocating heat, blasting the solid rock with heavy dynamite and hauling the radioactive dirt out in heavy diesel dump trucks. And the French investigators immediately set up a heavily guarded command post in the mine supervisor's main office. They seized all the daily production logs, the massive train schedules, and the complex financial ledgers. They were actively looking for a shadow operation, trying to find a group of corrupt facility managers who might be secretly skimming the richest veins of ore during the night shift and selling them to foreign buyers. They intensely interviewed the train conductors who drove the raw ore to the distant coast, looking for any unexplained stops in the middle of the dark jungle. But as the forensic accountants dug deeper into the raw production data, they found that the local record-keeping was actually completely perfect. Every single pound of dirt that was blasted out of the deep canyon walls was accurately weighed and loaded onto the heavy trains. There were no missing shipments. There were no secret off-book night trains. The entire logistical supply chain was completely airtight, and the elite investigators quickly realized that absolutely nothing was being physically stolen from the active supply line. So the senior physicists decided they needed to bypass the human supply chain entirely. They put on thick canvas protective gear and heavy steel-toed boots, and they walked straight down into the massive stepped crater of the open pit mine. And they carried heavy, gas-powered portable drilling rigs down into the deepest, hottest sections of the exposed rock. And they started cutting cylindrical, raw rock core samples directly out of the deep canyon walls, strictly targeting places in the earth that human hands had never even touched before. And they set up a completely makeshift testing laboratory right there in the intense heat of the open mine. They powered up their own heavy, portable mass spectrometers using loud diesel generators. And they crushed the raw, untouched rock cores into fine dust and ran them through the machines. And the elite investigators stood in a tight circle around the mechanical printer, wiping heavy sweat from their faces as they waited for the thin paper to spit out the absolute isotopic numbers. And when the paper finally came out, the numbers printed on the page were actually even lower than the ones Henri had originally found in France. Some of the raw veins buried in the rock were reading at 0.600%. And some samples pulled from the absolute deepest parts of the open mine were as incredibly low as 0.440%. And the senior physicists were completely paralyzed, because the entire criminal theft theory instantly evaporated right in front of their eyes. Nobody was physically stealing the heavy uranium during transport. Nobody was secretly skimming off the top of the shipments. The uranium was already heavily depleted in the ground before the miners even used dynamite to blast it out of the earth. And this massive revelation left the investigation with a massive, glaring physical problem. Because the only known mechanism in the entire universe that can change the isotopic ratio of raw uranium and artificially burn away the U-235 is a sustained, extremely violent nuclear chain reaction. And achieving a sustained nuclear chain reaction actively requires a highly complex, intricately designed man-made reactor. It actively requires thousands of precise graphite control rods, thousands of gallons of heavy water cooling systems to prevent a catastrophic meltdown, and massive thick concrete containment domes. It requires the absolute brightest engineering minds on the planet, working together in a highly controlled environment. But there were absolutely no secret high-tech underground laboratories buried in the humid jungle of Gabon. There was just ancient, totally undisturbed sedimentary sandstone. So the French Atomic Energy Commission immediately flew in a highly specialized team of some of the most brilliant geologists and nuclear chemists in the world to stare at this specific dirt. And they spent several weeks carefully extracting hundreds of delicate samples of the surrounding rock. And they securely shipped these specific rock samples back to highly advanced laboratories in Paris, running them through incredibly detailed chemical analysis, looking for any possible physical explanation for how the heavy atoms could be naturally split entirely inside a solid mountain. And it wasn't until a small team of analytical chemists started testing the surrounding dirt for very specific, highly rare trace elements that they finally found their answer. Because when heavy uranium goes through a volatile nuclear fission reaction, the raw matter doesn't just vanish into thin air. It violently splits into lighter, completely different chemical elements. And two of the most specific, undeniable physical byproducts of nuclear fission are the highly rare isotopes of neodymium and ruthenium. And when the chemists carefully looked at the mass spectrometer readings for the standard dirt surrounding the deep uranium veins in Oklo, the solid rock was absolutely flooded with high concentrations of neodymium and ruthenium. It was the exact undeniable chemical signature of heavily spent nuclear fuel. And if you recall, that dry, microscopic number of 0.717% that Henri found printed on a thin slip of paper in his laboratory in France. That missing 0.003% was not stolen by a shadow network or a rogue military. It had actually been violently burned away by the Earth itself. Using the massive amount of geological and chemical data heavily recovered from the deep excavation site, scientists were actively able to reconstruct an event that fundamentally altered our entire modern understanding of natural history. And here is a reconstruction of exactly what happened at the Oklo site roughly 2 billion years ago. Long before the very first multicellular life forms even existed on the planet, the landscape of what is now Gabon was a massive, completely barren river delta. And over millions of years, heavy seasonal rains continually washed massive amounts of naturally occurring uranium down from the higher mountains. And the fast-moving water deeply deposited this heavy metal into incredibly thick, highly concentrated seams, buried deep inside the porous sandy rock. Now, 2 billion years ago, the natural radioactive decay of the entire Earth was completely different. The natural concentration of uranium-235 across the entire planet was actually much higher than it is today. It was sitting at roughly 3%. And this specific 3% mark is incredibly significant, because that is the exact same high concentration that human scientists artificially create to use in modern, highly advanced commercial nuclear power plants today. And as this highly concentrated raw uranium sat completely buried in the deep rock, the natural groundwater from the massive river slowly seeped down through the porous stone and completely flooded into the highly radioactive seams. And this deep underground water perfectly acted as a natural neutron moderator. It physically slowed down the high-energy subatomic neutrons that were constantly bouncing off the heavy uranium atoms, allowing them to effectively collide with other atoms and violently split them apart. And deep underground in the total darkness of the prehistoric Earth, a spontaneous, entirely natural nuclear chain reaction ignited. The raw, underground rocks literally became a fully functioning high-temperature nuclear reactor. And as the atoms rapidly split apart, the dense rock generated massive amounts of intense thermal heat. And the cold groundwater trapped inside the narrow seams quickly boiled into extremely high-pressure steam. And this heavy steam blasted its way completely up through the narrow cracks in the rock to the open surface. But when the water completely boiled away, the powerful chain reaction instantly lost its physical moderator. So the deep reaction would safely pause entirely, preventing a massive, highly catastrophic nuclear explosion from violently ripping the ground apart. And the deep rocks would slowly cool down over several hours. And the groundwater would eventually seep back into the empty seams, and the entire violent cycle would start all over again. And this completely natural, perfectly self-sustaining nuclear reactor successfully operated completely inside the Earth's solid crust for hundreds of thousands of years. It continuously pulsed with intense radioactive heat, quietly boiling the deep groundwater and slowly burning through its own dense fuel supply, until the uranium-235 was finally depleted below the critical mass threshold, and the massive underground reactor permanently shut itself down. The complete discovery of the Oklo mine completely revolutionized the modern field of nuclear physics, definitively proving that nature had perfectly mastered atomic energy billions of years before humans even existed. And after extensive, highly detailed scientific study, the massive site was eventually mined out and completely exhausted of its valuable resources. And to this day, out of all the millions of deep geological surveys actively conducted across the entire globe, the ancient sandstone of Oklo remains the first and only naturally occurring nuclear reactor ever discovered on planet Earth. And while the deep Earth can quietly hide massive, highly destructive physical forces for billions of years without anyone knowing, sometimes the ordinary things hidden right in plain sight, sitting quietly by the side of a rural dirt road, can instantly trigger a violent conspiracy that tears an entire government apart. On the evening of May 31st, 1972, 33-year-old Antonio Ferraro was standing inside a brightly lit Carabinieri police station in the city of Gorizia, Italy. And Antonio was a highly experienced veteran military police officer who had spent years patrolling this specific region. And Gorizia is located in the extreme northeastern corner of Italy, sitting right against the border of what was then Yugoslavia. So the local police were completely accustomed to dealing with border smugglers, illegal border crossings, and stolen vehicles. But on this particular Wednesday night, the weather was absolutely miserable. A heavy cold rain was falling across the entire region, turning all the rural dirt roads into deep, thick mud. And Antonio was scheduled to work a long night patrol shift alongside two younger officers. There was 33-year-old Donato Poveromo, who was a very dedicated, hard-working officer with a wife and young children at home. And there was 23-year-old Franco Don Giovanni, who was the youngest of the group and served as their primary driver. So the three men put on their heavy dark blue military uniforms. They grabbed their heavy leather utility belts, and they drank a few small cups of incredibly strong espresso in the break room to stay awake. And they walked out into the pouring rain, climbing into their dark blue Alfa Romeo patrol car. And Franco started the engine, turned on the heavy windshield wipers, and drove out of the city limits, heading out to patrol the dark, empty rural roads near the border. Now, for the first few hours of their shift, the patrol was completely routine. They drove past large, empty farm fields and thick, dark patches of wood. And the only sound in the car was the heavy rain hitting the metal roof and the steady clicking of the windshield wipers. But right around 10:35 p.m., the heavy rotary phone sitting on the front desk back at the main police station in Gorizia suddenly rang. And the desk sergeant picked up the heavy receiver. And the voice on the other end of the line belonged to a man speaking in a very thick, rural Italian dialect. And the man sounded slightly out of breath. He told the sergeant that he was just driving down a rural dirt road near the tiny village of Petiano, which was a very small, isolated farming community a few miles outside of Gorizia. And the caller said he saw a white Fiat 500 parked awkwardly in a drainage trench on the side of the road. And the caller specifically noted that the car looked completely abandoned, but it had two distinct bullet holes shattered right through the front windshield. And before the sergeant could ask for the man's name, the caller gave one final, very specific piece of advice. He told the sergeant that when the officers go out there to look at the car, they need to make sure they open and check the front hood very carefully. And then the man hung up the phone. So the desk sergeant immediately picked up his two-way radio and called Antonio Donato and Franco out in their patrol car. He gave them the exact coordinates of the dirt road near Petiano, and he relayed the strange message about the bullet holes in the front hood. And Franco turned the steering wheel, leaving the paved highway and driving their patrol car deep into the rural, muddy farm roads. And about 20 minutes later, the headlights of their Alfa Romeo swept across a dark, muddy trench on the right side of the road. And sitting right in the tall, wet grass, completely dark and silent, was a small white Fiat 500. So Franco parked their patrol car a few yards away, leaving the engine running and the headlights shining directly onto the white vehicle. And the three men stepped out into the heavy rain, pulling heavy metal flashlights from their belts. And they walked slowly through the thick mud, shining their bright beams of light over the metal exterior of the small car. And just as the anonymous caller had promised, there were two very clear, shattered bullet holes punched directly through the glass of the windshield. But when Antonio shined his flashlight through the side windows and illuminated the interior seats, the car was completely empty. There was no driver, there were no passengers, and there was absolutely no blood on the vinyl seats or the dashboard. And the men stood in the rain looking at the empty car. And they naturally began to run through the standard police protocols for an abandoned, damaged vehicle. Because this was a border region, a car with bullet holes usually meant that a group of smugglers had gotten into a shootout, abandoned their vehicle, and fled on foot across the border into Yugoslavia. But Donato remembered the very specific instruction that the desk sergeant had passed along from the anonymous caller. The caller had insisted they check the front hood. Now, the Fiat 500 is a very unique compact car because the engine is actually located in the back behind the rear seats. And the front hood, where a normal car engine would be, is actually just a hollow metal trunk space used for storing luggage or a spare tire. So Donato figured that if a group of armed smugglers had abandoned the car, they might have hidden their illegal weapons, or stolen cash, or contraband right inside that front storage compartment before running away into the woods. So it was a completely reasonable standard police procedure to open that compartment and secure whatever was inside. and Donato walked around to the front bumper of the little white car. He reached his hand down under the cold, wet metal lip of the hood, and he found the mechanical latch. And he squeezed the metal lever and he pulled the heavy hood upward. And the instant the metal hood lifted even a fraction of an inch, a massive, blinding flash of orange light completely consumed the entire road. And a deafening, violent shockwave physically ripped the small car into thousands of jagged pieces of flying metal. The explosion was so incredibly powerful that it instantly vaporized the front half of the Fiat, blowing a massive, deep crater straight into the muddy road. And the sheer concussive force of the blast physically picked up Donato, Antonio, and Franco and threw them violently through the air, sending them crashing into the muddy fields several yards away. And the explosion was so loud that it echoed for miles across the empty farming valleys. And a second Carabinieri patrol car, which was driving a few miles away, heard the massive blast and immediately sped toward the location. And when the backup officers arrived at the scene, they found total, absolute devastation. The dark blue Alfa Romeo patrol car was heavily damaged, its windows completely blown out. The white Fiat was reduced to a blackened, smoking pile of twisted metal. And the backup officers ran into the tall, wet grass with their flashlights, frantically searching for their friends. But the blast had been completely catastrophic. Donato Poveromo, Antonio Ferraro, and Franco Don Giovanni had absorbed the absolute, full, unfiltered force of the massive explosion, and all three men were killed almost instantly. And by the very next morning, the entire nation of Italy was in a state of absolute massive panic. The local police station in Gorizia was completely devastated by the loss of their three men. But before the local detectives could even begin to tape off the massive crater and collect the twisted metal fragments, highly ranked military officials completely swarmed the tiny rural town. The Italian Military Intelligence Agency, which was known as the SID, essentially took total aggressive control of the entire investigation. Now, you have to understand the political climate in Italy in 1972. It was a period known as the Years of Lead. The country was completely divided, and there was massive, constant political violence happening in the streets. There were violent riots, frequent kidnappings, and deep paranoia. And the government was constantly fighting against heavily armed left-wing communist militant groups like the Red Brigades, who wanted to completely overthrow the capitalist state. And within 24 hours of the explosion in Petiano, the senior generals at the SID held a massive press conference. And they confidently announced to the entire country that the bombing was a highly calculated, ruthless ambush carried out entirely by violent left-wing communist militants. They claimed that the communists had lured the police out to the road specifically to murder them and strike fear into the government. And the government used this exact tragedy as massive political fuel. The police were given broad, sweeping powers to aggressively crack down on the left wing. Over the next few weeks, heavily armed police units kicked down the doors of hundreds of apartments across the country. They arrested young college students, they detained left-wing political activists, and they threw over 200 innocent people into jail, aggressively interrogating them about the bombing. But despite making hundreds of arrests, the SID never actually brought formal murder charges against anyone. They would arrest people, hold them for a few months, and then quietly release them when the evidence didn't hold up in court. And this chaotic, completely broken cycle of false arrests and dead ends continued for years. A decade slowly passed. The widows of Donato, Antonio, and Franco were given official state pensions and heavy medals of honor, but they were never given the truth. And the destroyed, twisted wreckage of the white Fiat 500 was left sitting in a dark, dusty police evidence garage, completely forgotten by the public. And the case went completely cold. But in 1984, 12 full years after the bombing, a young, incredibly stubborn investigating judge named Felice Casson was working out of an office in the city of Venice. And Casson was specifically tasked with reviewing old, unsolved terrorism cases from the 1970s. And he was a man who absolutely hated loose ends. He didn't care about politics or public opinion. He only cared about the physical, documented paper trail. So Casson physically drove to the Gorizia police station. He walked down into their basement archives, and he ordered the local officers to bring him every single cardboard box of physical evidence and every single typewritten report associated with the 1972 Petiano bombing. And he loaded all these heavy boxes into his car, drove back to his quiet office in Venice, and started reading. And almost immediately, Casson noticed a massive, glaring physical contradiction in the forensic files. because Casson realized that the entire country, the media, and the local police were completely wrong about their most basic assumption. Everyone assumed the bombing was a communist attack because the CID generals told them it was, but the physical chemistry told a completely different story. Casson pulled out the original laboratory analysis of the chemical explosive residue that was scraped off the twisted metal of the Fiat, and the local police chemist, in 1972, had clearly identified the explosive material as a highly stable, completely synthetic compound known as T4. Now, whenever the left-wing communist groups like the Red Brigades built bombs, they were generally poorly funded and lacked military connections. So they almost always built their bombs using stolen commercial mining dynamite, or they mixed rudimentary, highly volatile agricultural fertilizers like ammonium nitrate. But T4 is not a homemade fertilizer. T4 is an incredibly powerful, highly restricted military-grade plastic explosive. And in 1972, T4 was strictly and exclusively used by the Italian armed forces and NATO military units. There was absolutely no way a group of college-aged communist rebels got their hands on a massive brick of military C4 or T4. So Casson kept digging through the old, dusty paperwork, and he found the original photographs of the white Fiat sitting in the dirt road before it exploded, and he looked very closely at the 2 bullet holes in the windshield. And then he read the original ballistics report. And the ballistics report stated that there was absolutely no shattered glass found on the hood of the car or on the ground in front of the vehicle. All of the broken glass was resting completely on the interior dashboard. And Casson realized that those shots were not fired by a group of smugglers running away in a gunfight. Those shots were fired from directly inside the car at point-blank range, pointing outward. The bullet holes were nothing but a completely staged visual decoy, deliberately created to make the car look like it had been in a shootout, specifically to guarantee that the police would stop and investigate it. And then Casson found the most damning piece of paper in the entire archive. He found an internal, highly classified memo written by a senior SID intelligence general in 1972. And this memo was an explicit, direct order to a local police mechanic. The general ordered the mechanic to take a metal saw, physically cut away a specific section of the Fiat's metal frame that held the electrical wiring for the bomb, and bury that piece of metal in a civilian scrapyard, so it could never be examined by a judge. And Casson sat at his heavy wooden desk, completely paralyzed by what he was reading. He realized the communists didn't build the bomb. He realized the military intelligence generals knew the communists didn't build the bomb. He realized the state intelligence agency had actively destroyed physical evidence. And he realized they did all of this to protect the identity of the real killer. So Casson spent the next several months quietly pulling restricted banking records, old military deployment files, and classified border logs. He meticulously cross-referenced every single piece of data he could find. And eventually he found a name, buried deep in an old, unrelated weapons smuggling ledger. The man who wired the bomb was a 24-year-old extremist named Vincenzo Vinciguerra. He was not a left-wing rebel. He was a highly trained, violently radical right-wing neo-fascist. And if you recall that anonymous, heavy-breathing phone call to the police station telling the desk sergeant to specifically make sure the officers checked the front hood, that was not a concerned local citizen reporting an abandoned car. That was Vincenzo Vinciguerra himself. And he insisted they check the hood because he had physically wired the brick of T4 explosives directly to the mechanical tension cable of the hood latch. It was a completely engineered trap, specifically designed so that whoever pulled the lever would manually complete the electrical circuit, forcing the police officers to inadvertently pull the trigger on themselves. And Casson issued a massive secret arrest warrant. And he tracked Vinciguerra's movements through various European borders, eventually locating him hiding completely out of sight in Spain. And in 1987, Italian authorities formally detained Vinciguerra and brought him back to Italy to stand trial for the murders of Donato Poveromo, Antonio Ferraro, and Franco Don Giovanni. And when Vinciguerra finally sat in the crowded courtroom facing the judge and the press, he didn't deny anything. In fact, he calmly and coldly confessed to the entire bombing. He sat in his chair and proudly explained exactly how he wired the trap and why he targeted the police. He admitted that he carried out the bombing specifically to provoke a massive violent reaction from the state. He wanted to kill police officers so that the public would be completely consumed by fear, forcing the government to declare a state of emergency, suspend democratic rights, and install a harsh authoritarian regime to restore order. And then Vinciguerra dropped a massive bombshell that completely shattered the entire Italian government. He testified that he did not act alone in hiding from the law. He stated that the highest-ranking generals in the CID, the very people tasked with protecting the country, knew exactly who he was the very night of the bombing. And instead of arresting him, the military intelligence agency actively helped him with safe houses, they gave him a fake passport, and they personally smuggled him across the border into Spain so he would never face justice. This horrific revelation definitively proved the existence of the strategy of tension. A dark, completely unhinged political conspiracy where elements of the state secretly protected right-wing terrorists, allowing them to murder innocent citizens specifically, so they could blame the violence on their political rivals and manipulate the entire country through fear. Vincenzo Vinciguerra was ultimately found fully guilty of the triple homicide and was sentenced to life in prison. And Judge Cassin's relentless, unyielding investigation also led to the unprecedented criminal convictions of several high-ranking military intelligence officials, including General Giandelio Maletti, who was found guilty of actively obstructing justice and destroying evidence to protect a known terrorist. And while this incredibly dark, violent crime was carried out in a muddy, freezing trench by people trying to manipulate the psychology of an entire nation, sometimes a massive crime is committed in a completely pristine, brightly lit room by people who just want to walk away with millions of dollars in cash, wearing incredibly nice suits. On the very early morning of January, the 2nd of 1972, a 55-year-old man named Arthur was standing behind a massive, polished mahogany desk in New York City. And Arthur was the senior night manager of the Pierre Hotel. Now, the Pierre was not just a regular place for tourists to sleep. It was a massive, incredibly ornate stone building sitting directly on Fifth Avenue, right across the street from Central Park, and it was widely considered to be the absolute pinnacle of high society and wealth in the entire country. And Arthur took immense pride in his job. He had worked at the Pierre for nearly 2 decades, and he made it his personal mission to memorize the faces and the specific habits of every single permanent resident in the building. Because the upper floors of the hotel were entirely made up of permanent, privately owned luxury apartments. And the people who lived in these apartments were aristocratic billionaires, heavy industry tycoons, and massive Hollywood movie stars. So Arthur was completely used to dealing with extremely demanding, highly eccentric people. And his primary job on the overnight shift was to maintain total, absolute quiet and security so the wealthy residents could sleep. And on this particular morning, Arthur was feeling incredibly exhausted because the hotel was just coming off the massive, chaotic rush of New Year's Eve. For the past 48 hours, the massive lobby had been completely packed with people drinking expensive champagne and throwing loud, lavish parties in the main ballrooms. But by 3:50 in the morning on January 2nd, the massive New Year's hangover had finally set in. The massive hotel was completely dead, and the heavy, ornate chandeliers hanging from the ceiling were turned down low. The thick velvet curtains were pulled shut against the bitter, freezing January wind outside. And the only sound in the massive marble lobby was the low, quiet hum of the heavy iron radiators, pushing heat into the room. And Arthur was standing behind the front desk, quietly organizing a stack of guest ledgers. And there were only a few other employees awake in the entire building. There was a young security guard sitting on a stool near the main elevators, an older elevator operator reading a newspaper in the service hallway, and a few cleaning women quietly vacuuming the heavy carpets up on the 10th floor. And right around 3:55 in the morning, Arthur looked up from his paperwork. He saw the heavy glass revolving doors at the front entrance slowly start to turn, and 4 men walked into the quiet lobby. And Arthur immediately assessed their appearance because that was his job, and these 4 men looked completely immaculate. They were all wearing extremely expensive, custom-tailored black tuxedos. They had crisp white shirts, perfectly tied bow ties, and expensive leather dress shoes. And they were carrying a few heavy leather duffel bags. So Arthur just naturally assumed that these were wealthy guests returning from a very late high-end New Year's after-party somewhere out in the city. And as the 4 men walked across the heavy marble floor toward the front desk, Arthur stood up completely straight and put on his standard polite customer service smile. "Good morning, gentlemen. How can I help you?" And the lead man in the tuxedo, who had perfectly combed dark hair, smiled back at Arthur. And he reached his right hand inside the breast pocket of his expensive tuxedo jacket. But he didn't pull out a room key or a leather wallet. He pulled out a heavy, dark metal revolver with a long, thick, cylindrical silencer attached to the barrel. And he pointed the heavy barrel directly at Arthur's chest. But the man did not shout. He did not curse, and he did not raise his voice. He spoke in a very calm, polite, highly educated tone. "Good morning, sir. We are taking over the hotel. Please step out from behind the desk and lie flat on the floor." And Arthur was completely frozen. He looked at the heavy gun, and he looked at the man's polite smile. And Arthur slowly raised his hands in the air, walked around the heavy mahogany desk, and laid face down on the cold marble floor. And the four men in tuxedos immediately moved with absolute silent precision. They didn't panic, and they didn't rush. Two of the men walked over to the young security guard sitting by the elevators, pointed their suppressed weapons at him, and quietly ordered him to lay on the ground next to Arthur. And then the men began a highly systematic, meticulous hunt through the massive, quiet hotel. They left one man in the lobby to watch the front doors, and the other three men took the main elevators up into the building. And over the next 30 minutes, they quietly intercepted every single employee working the night shift. They found the elevator operator in the service hallway. They found the cleaning women up on the 10th floor. They found the basement maintenance workers checking the boilers. And they brought all 19 employees down to a single windowless staff locker room behind the main lobby. And the men in the tuxedos pulled heavy metal handcuffs and thick rolls of surgical tape out of their leather bags. And they carefully bound the hands and feet of every single employee. And the lead man in the tuxedo actually apologized to one of the older cleaning women, asking her if the handcuffs were completely comfortable or if they were pinching her wrists too tightly. And once the entire night staff was completely secured in the locker room, the lead man walked back over to Arthur, who was still laying on the marble floor in the lobby. And he grabbed Arthur by the back of his uniform jacket and pulled him up to his feet. "We need to go down to the basement. You are going to open the outer gate to the vault." Now, the safe deposit vault at the Pierre Hotel was completely legendary. It was not just a regular hotel safe where people kept a few $100s. Because the permanent residents of the Pierre were massive billionaires, they actively distrusted traditional Wall Street banks. They preferred to keep their physical wealth right inside the building where they lived. So, the basement vault held hundreds of massive steel lockboxes filled with millions of dollars in untraceable cash-heavy gold bars and priceless family heirlooms. And getting into this vault was incredibly difficult. You had to ride a specific secure service elevator down into the deep basement. Then you had to unlock a heavy steel cage door. And then you had to open a massive 3-foot-thick solid steel bank door just to get into the room with the boxes. And Arthur had the key to the outer steel cage on his belt. So Arthur rode the elevator down to the basement with two of the armed men. He used his key to open the heavy steel cage. And because it was the overnight shift, the massive internal steel bank door was actually left propped open so the guards could easily do their visual patrols. But there was a massive physical problem. Every single individual steel lockbox inside the vault required a dual key system to open. The hotel held one master key, but the individual resident held the second unique key. And the box physically could not be opened unless both keys were turned in the locks at the exact same time. And Arthur simply did not have the resident's keys. But the men in the tuxedos did not care. They told Arthur to lay face down on the basement floor. And the men unzipped their heavy leather duffel bags. And they didn't pull out delicate lockpicks or tiny tools. They pulled out massive, heavy industrial steel drills, long iron crowbars, and heavy bolt cutters. And for the next 2 hours, the quiet basement of the luxury hotel was filled with the deafening, grinding sound of heavy steel tearing through metal. The men systematically moved down the rows of lockboxes, physically destroying the heavy metal doors with their drills and prying them completely out of the wall with the crowbars. And the men were sweating heavily through their expensive tuxedos, working as fast as they physically could. They reached their hands into the deep metal boxes and pulled out thick stacks of $100 bills, heavy bundles of international bearer bonds, and massive velvet cases filled with heavy jewelry. And as one of the men pried open a specific box, he reached inside and pulled out a large, heavy velvet case. And this specific box belonged to the world-famous Italian actress Sophia Loren. And the man popped the velvet lid open. And sitting on the dark velvet was a massive, incredibly thick diamond necklace. And the central stone of this necklace was cut in a highly distinct, completely asymmetrical shape. It had incredibly sharp, abnormal angles that only a master jeweler could have physically carved. It was a completely unique, one-of-a-kind stone that had been heavily photographed and featured in massive magazines all over the world. And the robber holding the velvet box just stared at the massive diamond for a brief second. And then he just shrugged his shoulders, grabbed the heavy necklace with his sweaty hand, and carelessly tossed it directly into a dirty canvas bag alongside loose stacks of paper money and generic gold watches. And by 6:15 in the morning, the men were completely exhausted. They had physically drilled and completely destroyed 54 separate safe deposit boxes. And they had stuffed a staggering $27 million in physical cash and jewels into their heavy canvas bags. So the men zipped up their bags. They walked back upstairs to the main lobby, carrying the massive weight of the stolen millions. They walked into the staff locker room one last time to check on the 19 tied-up hostages. And the lead man in the tuxedo smiled, politely wished the terrified staff a happy new year, and actually reached into his pocket and left a $20 bill on the table as a tip for Arthur. And then the four men simply walked out the front glass doors of the hotel, loaded the heavy canvas bags into the trunk of a waiting black limousine, and drove completely away into the early morning Manhattan traffic. And when the daytime staff finally arrived at the hotel a few hours later and found the hostages tied up in the locker room, absolute chaos completely erupted. The New York Police Department and the FBI swarmed the massive luxury hotel. They set up a massive command center in the lobby. And the federal investigators immediately walked down into the basement to examine the massive vault. And the scene was completely pristine. Aside from the violently destroyed metal boxes, there was absolutely no physical evidence left behind. There were no stray hairs, no dropped tools, and absolutely no fingerprints anywhere in the room. And the senior FBI agents stood in the destroyed vault looking at the empty boxes, and they operated under a massive, unyielding assumption. The federal agents completely believed that a robbery of this magnitude could only have been pulled off by an elite, highly funded international syndicate. Because local street thugs do not wear custom-tailored tuxedos. They do not use high-end suppressed weaponry. They do not speak with highly educated, polite vocabulary. And they absolutely do not execute a flawless, non-violent, multi-hour hostage situation in the most heavily guarded luxury hotel on the planet. So the FBI completely ignored the local New York street gangs. Instead, they assumed the robbers were part of a sophisticated European theft ring like the French Connection or the Pink Panthers. And the federal agents wasted weeks aggressively contacting Interpol in Paris and London. They meticulously audited international flight manifests out of JFK Airport, desperately looking for any wealthy foreign nationals who had suddenly booked first-class tickets out of the country on the morning of January 2nd. But the detectives were wrong about their most basic assumption. The men who robbed the Pierre Hotel were not international billionaires. They were not French mastermind. They were just a small local crew of mob-affiliated street criminals from New York. The sophisticated lead man in the tuxedo was just a local mob associate named Samuel Margulies. His heavily armed partners were just local street enforcers named Robert Comfort, Ali Ben, and Al Green. They weren't wealthy aristocrats. They had literally rented their expensive tuxedos from a cheap local shop the day before the heist, specifically to blend in with the high society crowd on New Year's Eve. And while the FBI was aggressively searching the globe for international supercriminals, Samuel Margulies and his crew had just driven their limousine straight out to a cheap, dingy, incredibly dirty roadside motel in New Jersey. And the men walked into the cheap motel room, locked the thin wooden door, and dumped their heavy canvas bags directly onto the cheap mattress. And a massive mountain of cash and heavy jewels spilled out onto the blanket. They had successfully pulled off a $27 million heist, and dividing up the physical cash was incredibly easy. They just sat on the floor and counted out the stacks of $100 bills into equal piles. But then they turned their attention to the massive pile of heavy jewelry sitting on the mattress, and they realized they had a massive, crippling problem. Because Samuel Margulies and his crew had spent months meticulously planning exactly how to get inside the Pierre Hotel, how to tie up the guards, and how to drill the boxes. But they had spent absolutely zero time planning how to actually sell the items they stole. And when one of the crew members took that massive, heavily distinct diamond necklace to a highly connected underground black market fence in Brooklyn. The fence took one look at it and completely refused to buy it. And if you recall that massive, completely unique central stone with the highly asymmetrical custom cut angles that belonged to Sophia Loren, that specific cut was the exact reason the fence refused to touch it. Because a diamond that famous is completely radioactive. Every single police officer, federal agent, and jeweler in the entire world was actively looking for that specific stone. And the fence bluntly explained to the crew that if he tried to sell a custom stone belonging to Sophia Loren, the FBI would kick his door down in 10 minutes. The diamond was far too unique to be fenced, and it was far too famous to be broken down into smaller stones without destroying its entire value. And the crew suddenly realized they were sitting on millions of dollars of physical jewels that were completely worthless to them. They couldn't use a famous diamond to buy groceries. They couldn't use a highly recognizable ruby necklace to pay their rent. And the situation rapidly escalated into total disaster, because the local mafia bosses in the Lucchese crime family quickly found out that Samuel's crew had pulled off the massive Pierre heist. And the mafia bosses aggressively demanded a massive 30% cut of the total $27 million as a street tax. But the crew physically did not have the cash to pay the mob, because the vast majority of their stolen wealth was locked up in these completely unsellable radioactive diamonds. And the mafia bosses did not care. They told the crew to pay the tax, or they would be killed. And under this massive crushing pressure from the mafia, the polite, highly sophisticated facade of the Tuxedo Crew completely shattered. The men locked themselves inside their cheap safe houses and started screaming at each other. They became incredibly paranoid. They pulled loaded guns on each other over the useless piles of jewelry, aggressively accusing one another of hiding the cash and leaving the unsellable stones behind. And the internal tension reached an absolute boiling point. One of the crew members, a career criminal who was absolutely furious that he was being hunted by the mob while holding millions of dollars in worthless rocks, decided he was completely done with the entire operation. So he walked out of his safe house, walked down the street to a public payphone, and dropped a single coin into the slot. And he dialed the direct number for the FBI field office in Manhattan. And he calmly gave the federal agents every single piece of information they needed. He gave them Samuel Margulies' name. He gave them Robert Comfort's exact address. He explained exactly how they rented the tuxedos. And he told the agents exactly which cheap apartments were holding the stolen, unsellable diamonds. And he deemed all of this simply to claim a massive cash reward from the government and to completely destroy the partners who had dragged him into a deadly situation with the mafia. And within hours of that single phone call, heavily armed FBI tactical teams violently kicked down the doors of the cheap apartments across New York and New Jersey. They easily arrested Samuel Margulies, Robert Comfort, and the rest of the local crew without a single shot being fired. The entire Tuxedo Crew was officially convicted of the massive heist, and they were sent to federal prison on extremely heavy sentences. The 1972 Pierre Hotel robbery was officially entered into the Guinness Book of World Records as the single largest, most successful hotel heist in modern human history. And despite the total collapse of the crew and the massive federal arrests, the authorities were only ever able to recover a very small fraction of the physical cash. The vast majority of the $27 million, including the massive asymmetrical custom-cut diamonds, completely vanished into the deep underground of the criminal world, and they have never been seen again. And while some massive criminal conspiracies completely unravel simply because the thieves don't know how to sell the items they stole, other dark mysteries remain completely unsolved because the people involved were actively trying to expose a truth so dangerous that their own colleagues had to permanently silence them. On the evening of March 3rd, 1972, 36-year-old Shirley Briffman was sitting alone inside her small, very quiet apartment in Clayfield, which is a very quiet, middle-class residential suburb, located in the city of Brisbane, Australia. And Shirley was a woman who lived her entire life with absolute rigid physical organization. She was incredibly meticulous about everything she did. She always kept her apartment completely spotless. She always made sure her hair and makeup were perfectly done before she even walked out to check the mail. And she kept incredibly detailed handwritten journals documenting every single day of her life. And on this particular Friday evening, the weather outside was extremely hot and humid, which is very typical for Queensland in the late summer. And Shirley was sitting at a heavy wooden desk, pushed up against the wall of her small living room. and the desk was completely covered in thick stacks of legal paperwork, yellow legal pads, and heavy manila folders. And she was holding a pen, carefully reviewing long typewritten documents and occasionally making small, neat corrections in the margins of the paper. And right around 8 o'clock that night, her telephone rang, and Shirley picked up the heavy receiver and she spoke to one of her very close personal friends for about 20 minutes. And her friend later noted that Shirley sounded completely normal. She was incredibly focused. She was talking very quickly about her upcoming travel plans. And she was actively complaining about how much paperwork she had to read through before the weekend was over. And she told her friend she was just going to finish reading a few more pages, take a warm bath, and go straight to sleep. "I will call you tomorrow morning. Get some sleep, Shirley." And Shirley hung up the heavy phone, placed it back on the desk, and the apartment went completely silent. And from the outside, she just looked like a dedicated professional working late into the night. But the reality of Shirley Briffman's life was completely different. Because the massive stack of papers sitting perfectly aligned on her wooden desk was not a normal business contract. It was a massive, highly detailed, explosive legal testimony. And Shirley was not just a normal woman living in a quiet suburb. She was arguably the single most important, highly protected, and actively hunted criminal witness in the entire history of the Australian justice system. Now, to understand exactly why Shirley was sitting alone in a locked apartment surrounded by legal documents, you have to go back several years and look at the absolute state of the Australian police force in the 1960s. Because in cities like Sydney and Brisbane, the local police departments were not just struggling with crime. The police actively ran the crime. The entire system was completely consumed by a massive, highly organized, very violent protection racket. And back in the late 60s, Shirley Briffman was living in Sydney. And she was a highly intelligent, incredibly charismatic woman who had built a massive, extremely lucrative, illegal empire. She was the most successful and well-known madam in the city. She operated a massive network of high-end, extremely expensive, illegal brothels scattered all across the wealthy neighborhoods. And she catered strictly to high society clients, politicians, and wealthy businessmen. But you could not operate an illegal business of that massive size in Sydney without the explicit permission of the local police. And the senior detectives in the Vice Squad did not just ask for a small, polite bribe. They ran the city like a mafia syndicate. Every single Friday, heavily armed senior police detectives would physically walk into Shirley's brothels. And they would sit on her expensive couches, drink her expensive liquor, and demand massive, thick envelopes stuffed with untraceable cash. And if a madam refused to pay the police, or if the envelope was slightly light, the detectives would completely destroy the business. They would physically smash the expensive furniture with heavy wooden clubs. They would violently arrest all the women working there, and they would lock the doors permanently. So Shirley became incredibly valuable to the corrupt police because she was a brilliant negotiator. She became the primary bagwoman for the entire district. She would actively collect the massive bribes from all the other illegal businesses in the area and hand-deliver massive bags of cash directly to the highest-ranking police officers in the state. And because she was the central hub for all this dirty money, Shirley knew absolutely everything. She knew the exact names of the detectives who took the money. She knew exactly how much they were paid. She knew where they hid the cash, and she knew exactly which violent officers were directly responsible for orchestrating brutal assaults against rival gang members. She carried the entire structural blueprint of the massive police corruption ring directly in her head. And for years, this highly illegal relationship worked perfectly. The police got incredibly wealthy, and Shirley got to run her massive empire without any interference. But right around 1970, the senior detectives started to get incredibly greedy. They started demanding massively increased payouts. They started physically threatening Shirley, telling her that if she didn't double their weekly cash deliveries, they would forcefully take her children away and throw her into a maximum security prison for the rest of her life. And Shirley was completely exhausted. She was tired of the constant physical threats, and she was terrified for the safety of her family. So she decided to do something that absolutely no one in the criminal underworld had ever dared to do. She decided to break the ultimate code of silence. She decided to actively burn the entire corrupt police force to the ground. In 1971, Shirley completely abandoned her massive criminal empire in Sydney. She packed a small bag, she walked directly into a massive national television studio, and she sat down for a highly publicized broadcast interview. And on national television, right in front of millions of viewers, Shirley calmly and meticulously exposed the entire protection racket. She started naming names. She specifically named some of the most violent, heavily feared senior detectives in the New South Wales police force, and she detailed exactly how they extorted her on a weekly basis. And the entire country was completely paralyzed by the broadcast. The sheer volume of her incredibly detailed, highly specific knowledge forced the federal government to completely bypass the local police and immediately launch a massive, closed-door royal commission into police corruption. And Shirley was declared the absolute star witness for the state. She spent hundreds of hours sitting in secure rooms with federal prosecutors actively drafting thousands of pages of sworn affidavits, preparing to completely dismantle the careers of dozens of powerful, heavily armed men. But exposing a massive, violent syndicate of corrupt police officers carries an incredibly heavy physical toll. Because the men she was testifying against were not locked away in a prison cell, they still had their badges. They still carried loaded service weapons. And they still had total, absolute access to the entire state police database. And the death threats started almost immediately. Shirley would be sitting in her living room, and the heavy rotary phone would ring at 2 in the morning. And when she picked up the receiver, there would just be heavy, slow breathing on the other end, followed by the sound of a gun hammer clicking back. She would find dead animals left on the hood of her car. She would constantly see dark, unmarked sedans parked idling at the end of her street, watching her house for hours. And the federal prosecutors knew she was in massive physical danger. So they completely relocated her out of Sydney, moving her hundreds of miles north to the quiet suburb of Clayfield in Brisbane, hoping to hide her until the massive trials were ready to begin in court. But by early 1972, Shirley knew they had found her. She was constantly exhausted. Her physical health was deteriorating from the massive crushing stress, and she was actively telling her friends that she was a dead woman walking. "You have to help me. They know exactly where I am. We are doing everything we can, Shirley. Just stay in the apartment. They are going to kill me to keep me out of that courtroom." And despite her massive fear, Shirley refused to back down. She spent every single day sitting at her wooden desk in Clayfield, meticulously typing out her final testimony, organizing the massive files, and preparing to take the witness stand in just a few short weeks. And this brings us right back to the quiet, humid evening of March 3rd, 1972. Shirley finishes her phone call, hangs up the receiver, and goes to sleep. The very next morning, March 4th, the sun comes up over Brisbane, and Shirley's close friend tries to call the apartment just to check in on her. But the phone just rings and rings. Nobody answers. And the friend waits a few hours, and then she calls back. But the phone just keeps ringing. So by the late afternoon, the friend becomes incredibly panicked. She drives her car directly to the quiet apartment building in Clayfield. She walks up the stairs and she knocks heavily on Shirley's solid wooden door. But there is absolutely no sound coming from inside the apartment. And the friend runs downstairs, finds the building manager, and demands that he bring the master key. The manager walks upstairs, slides the heavy brass key into the lock, and turns it. And the heavy wooden door swings open. And the apartment is completely silent. The thick curtains are pulled tightly shut, blocking out the afternoon sun. The air inside the room feels incredibly stale and heavy. And the friend walks slowly into the living room, calling out Shirley's name. But the apartment is completely still. And the friend walks down the short hallway and pushes open the bedroom door. And she sees Shirley Briffman laying completely flat on her back on top of the mattress. Her eyes are closed, her arms are resting neatly at her sides, and she is not breathing. Her skin is completely pale and her body is completely cold. And sitting on the small wooden nightstand right next to the bed is a small, completely empty glass bottle of prescription barbiturate sleeping pills. And the friend immediately runs to the telephone and dials the emergency operator. And within 20 minutes, local Brisbane police officers arrive at the quiet apartment complex. And they walk up the stairs, push past the crying friend, and walk directly into the dark bedroom. Now, normally when police get a call like this involving the sudden death of a highly protected federal witness, they lock down the entire building. They call in massive forensic teams, they dust every single doorknob for fingerprints, they secure the perimeter, and they treat the apartment as a highly active, contaminated homicide scene until a medical examiner can definitively prove otherwise. But the local Brisbane detectives who walked into Shirley's bedroom did absolutely none of those things. They walked into the room wearing their heavy street shoes, completely contaminating the floor. They didn't put on rubber gloves. They just stood over the bed, looked at the empty pill bottle on the nightstand and shrugged their shoulders. And they pulled small notebooks from their pockets and immediately wrote down the word suicide. They didn't search the apartment for forced entry. They didn't check the windows. They didn't even bother to look for a suicide note, which was incredibly strange, considering Shirley documented every single day of her life in meticulous handwritten journals. A woman who writes down what she eats for breakfast does not suddenly decide to end her own life without leaving a massive, highly detailed letter explaining exactly why. But the local police simply did not care. They aggressively rushed the local coroner to sign off on the paperwork, officially declaring that Shirley Briffman had intentionally ingested a massive lethal overdose of barbiturates because she simply could not handle the massive crushing psychological pressure of her upcoming federal court appearance. And the police held a very brief press conference officially stating that the star witness had suffered a complete mental breakdown and the massive corruption case was effectively closed. They operated under the completely false assumption that the public would just accept the narrative of a stressed, exhausted woman taking her own life. But the public, the federal prosecutors, and Shirley's close friends were completely outraged because they knew the police narrative was an absolute, transparent lie. And they knew it was a lie because of the incredibly specific physical layout of the living room when the police first walked through the front door. Because if you recall, that massive, completely perfect stack of highly detailed, typewritten legal testimony and manila folders sitting squarely on the heavy wooden desk in the living room, those documents were Shirley's absolute life's work. They were the singular weapon she was actively preparing to use against the corrupt officers. And when the local Brisbane detectives walked through the living room to get to the bedroom, they literally had to walk right past that desk. They walked right past the most explosive, highly sought-after criminal evidence in the entire country. And they didn't even stop to look at it. They didn't secure the files, they didn't log them into evidence, and they completely ignored their existence in the official police report. And that specific massive stack of ignored paperwork is the exact reason why this case is so incredibly dark. The files were completely ignored by the investigating officers because those officers were not actually there to solve a suspicious death. They were there to actively execute a massive, coordinated cover-up. The local police who responded to the apartment were the direct colleagues and close associates of the exact same corrupt, violent men that Shirley was actively trying to put in prison. They didn't need to investigate the empty pill bottle because they already knew exactly how those pills got into her system. They actively used the convenient guise of a mental breakdown to completely erase the massive legal value of those documents, ensuring that the star witness was permanently silenced before she could ever step foot inside a courtroom. Despite the massive, overwhelming public outcry and the glaring, completely obvious flaws in the incredibly rushed investigation, absolutely no police officers were ever formally charged with the murder of Shirley Briffman. The local department, Kumpandar, refused to reopen the case, and they aggressively maintained their official ruling of suicide. But the sheer, unapologetic transparency of the assassination and the completely blatant police cover-up that followed did not bury the truth. It actually achieved the exact opposite. The horrific death of Shirley Briffman became a massive, undeniable catalyst for public anger. It completely shattered the illusion of police integrity in Australia, directly fueling the massive, sweeping federal royal commissions that completely tore the police forces of New South Wales and Queensland apart over the next 10 years, leading to the arrests and disgraced resignations of hundreds of corrupt officers. And while some massive criminal conspiracies are carefully covered up by the very people sworn to protect the public, sometimes a massive catastrophic tragedy is caused simply because the people in charge are too angry to speak to each other. On the afternoon of June 18, 1972, 51-year-old Captain Stanley Key was standing inside the staff break room at London Heathrow Airport. And Stanley was a highly respected, heavily experienced veteran pilot for British European Airways. He had previously flown heavy bombers in the military, and he ran his commercial cockpit with the exact same rigid, absolute authority. He expected his junior officers to be completely silent, completely obedient, and perfectly uniform. He was the kind of man who would actively inspect the shine on his co-pilot's shoes before allowing them to board his aircraft. And at this specific time in 1972, the entire British aviation industry was dealing with a massive internal crisis. The younger junior pilots had formed a massive labor union, and they were actively voting to go on strike over their salaries and their mandatory rest hours. But Stanley absolutely despised the Union. He viewed the young, striking pilots as completely undisciplined and ungrateful. He completely believed that junior officers had absolutely no right to make demands of the airline. And he made his opinions extremely well known to anyone who would listen in the terminal. And right around 3:15 in the afternoon, just an hour before his scheduled flight to Brussels, Stanley was filling out his load sheets at a small table in the break room. And a young junior pilot from a completely different flight crew walked into the room, poured a cup of coffee, and made a casual, supportive comment about the upcoming union strike. And Stanley completely snapped. He pushed his chair back violently, stood up, and engaged in a massive screaming argument with the young pilot. His face turned bright red, the veins in his neck were actively bulging, and he was violently pointing his finger directly at the young man's chest. He slammed his flat hand down onto the heavy wooden table, sending coffee spilling out over the paperwork. And he shouted so loudly that the administrative staff in the next office over actually stopped working to listen through the thin walls. And Stanley aggressively told the young pilot that junior officers were completely lazy, entirely undisciplined, and completely lacked the fundamental respect required to fly heavy commercial machinery. And the younger pilot just stood there, completely taken aback by the sheer volume and physical aggression of the older captain. And after a few minutes of aggressive yelling, Stanley grabbed his heavy leather flight bag, turned around, and completely stormed out of the room. And he walked heavily down the long, carpeted corridor to meet his assigned crew for the afternoon. There was 24-year-old Simon Ticehurst, who was acting as the flight engineer. And sitting in the right seat was 22-year-old Jeremy Keeley, who was the first officer. And Jeremy was incredibly green. He had only been flying commercial passenger jets for a few weeks, and he was acutely aware of Stanley's massive, heavily authoritative reputation. Jeremy desperately wanted to make a good impression on the veteran captain, and he had spent the entire morning meticulously studying the flight charts. So when Stanley walked up to them at the gate desk with his face still heavily flushed and his jaw completely clenched, the two younger men did not say a single word. They simply picked up their heavy bags and they walked out onto the loud tarmac in absolute suffocating silence. And they climbed up the steep metal stairs and strapped themselves into the cramped cockpit of the Hawker Siddeley Trident. Now, the Trident was a massive, highly complex 3-engine passenger jet, and the cockpit was incredibly small. The flight engineer sat completely sideways behind the center console, meaning all three men were physically sitting within just a few inches of each other. But nobody spoke. Jeremy kept his hands firmly in his lap and stared straight ahead at the instrument panel, only speaking when directly asked a numerical question by the captain. And the boarding process for British European Airways Flight 548 was completely routine. 115 passengers walked down the aisles and took their seats in the cabin, completely unaware of the heavy, dark tension sitting just on the other side of the locked cockpit door. And right around 4 o'clock, the doors were sealed. Stanley pushed the heavy throttles forward. The three rear engines roared loudly, vibrating the entire metal fuselage, and the massive jet lifted off the wet runway, climbing up into the gray, overcast London sky, heading straight toward Belgium. And for the first 2 minutes of the flight, everything was completely normal. The air traffic controller back at Heathrow watched the small green radar blip climb steadily through 1,500 feet. And the controller pressed his radio button and instructed Captain Key to turn the aircraft slightly and contact the next sector control tower. And Stanley pressed his microphone button and briefly acknowledged the specific instruction. And that single short transmission was the absolute last time anyone ever heard from Flight 548. Down on the ground, a few miles away from the airport, a man was driving his car down the heavily congested A30 Staines bypass. And the traffic was moving incredibly slowly, and the man had his driver's side window rolled completely down. And he heard a strange, incredibly deep whining sound coming from the thick gray clouds directly above the highway. And he leaned forward and looked up through his windshield, fully expecting to see a plane flying forward over the road. But he did not see a plane flying forward. He saw a massive, 100,000-pound passenger jet falling completely flat belly, first straight down out of the clouds. And the jet did not dive forward, and it did not spin out of control. It simply dropped completely flat like a heavy stone. And the massive plane slammed violently into a small, wet patch of grass just a few yards away from the busy highway. The heavy impact completely severed the tail section from the main fuselage, sending massive chunks of twisted metal and heavy landing gear sliding completely across the wet dirt. The physical destruction was completely catastrophic. All 118 people on board were killed almost instantly upon hitting the ground. And within just a few hours, the British Air Accidents Investigation Branch, or the AAIB, completely locked down the entire massive field. And dozens of senior investigators put on heavy rubber boots and walked through the deep mud and the twisted metal, desperately looking for the specific mechanical failure that caused the crash. Because the investigators were completely wrong about their most basic assumption regarding this accident, now the Hawker Siddeley Trident has a very specific aerodynamic design known as a tail, where the small horizontal wings on the tail are mounted completely at the top of the large vertical fin. And this specific shape makes the plane highly susceptible to a very dangerous physical condition called a deep aerodynamic stall. If the plane flies too slowly, the air completely stops flowing smoothly over the massive wings, and the plane instantly loses all of its physical lift. And if a tail aircraft enters a deep stall, it is almost completely impossible to recover the plane using normal controls. The plane will simply fall entirely flat out of the sky, exactly like the witnesses on the highway reported. But the aviation engineers who originally built the Trident knew exactly how dangerous this specific stall was, so they installed an extremely aggressive, highly automated safety system called a stick pusher. If the aircraft's computers ever sensed that the plane was getting dangerously slow, a massive pneumatic ram powered by compressed air would automatically fire. And this ram would physically shove the pilot's control columns aggressively forward, actively forcing the nose of the plane down so it could pick up speed and save the flight. It was an absolute fail-safe mechanism. And the lead investigators looked at the broken tail section of the aircraft resting in the mud, and they naturally operated under a completely reasonable assumption. They assumed that a massive structural failure had physically broken the automated stick pusher system, because no highly trained veteran pilot would ever let a passenger jet intentionally stall in broad daylight, and they absolutely would not manually override the automated safety system unless it was already physically broken. So there had to be a mechanical explanation. They assumed the heavy pneumatic valves had simply ruptured under the intense pressure of the climb. So the AAIB brought in massive construction cranes, and they physically lifted the heavy tail section out of the dirt. And they transported the entire stick pusher mechanism back to a highly sterile laboratory. And they hooked the heavy metal valves up to large industrial air compressors to see exactly where the massive leak was. But when they turned the air compressors on, the heavy valves held the pressure perfectly. The metal pipes were completely intact. The electrical sensors were fully operational. The entire automated stick pusher system was working flawlessly. The plane was completely mechanically sound. And a few days later, a separate team of investigators found the heavy steel flight data recorder buried deep in the mud near the center of the crash site. And they physically pulled the thick metal foil tape out of the heavy machine, running it through their specialized equipment to graph out the exact altitude, speed, and mechanical inputs of the short flight. But when the senior investigators laid the massive sheets of graphed paper out on their large wooden tables, the numbers printed on the page made absolutely no logical sense. The physical data showed that just 90 seconds after takeoff, when the massive jet was still climbing through 1,500 feet, somebody in the cramped cockpit had manually reached down and pulled the heavy lever to retract the blades. Plane's flaps. Now the flaps are the heavy metal panels on the back edge of the wings that give the massive plane extra lift at slow speeds. And pilots are strictly trained to leave the flaps completely extended until the plane reaches a safe minimum speed of 225 knots. But the data showed the flap lever was pulled when the plane was only moving at 162 knots. The plane was moving far too slowly to survive without flaps. And the data graphed exactly what happened next. The second those heavy metal flaps folded away into the wings, the massive plane instantly lost its physical lift. The airspeed dropped massively. The heavy, loud stall warning horns immediately started blaring inside the tiny cockpit, and the automated stick pusher engaged perfectly exactly as it was designed to do. The computer actively fired the heavy pneumatic ram, violently shoving the captain's control column forward to force the nose down and save the plane. But then the data showed something completely impossible. Less than 2 seconds after the automated safety system engaged to save their lives, a human hand reached completely across the central console and manually grabbed the physical override switch. And they pulled it, actively dumping the compressed air and permanently disabling the stick pusher. And the plane's nose pitched completely upward. The massive aircraft entered an unrecoverable deep stall, and it fell completely flat out of the sky. The senior investigators simply stood around the large wooden tables, completely paralyzed by what they were looking at. Because manually disabling a stick pusher during an active stall warning is the absolute physical equivalent of unbuckling your seatbelt and manually forcing your car door open while actively crashing headfirst into a solid brick wall. It was a completely suicidal, entirely irrational physical action. And Stanley Key was a highly decorated, incredibly strict veteran pilot. He knew the complex systems of the Trident perfectly. There was absolutely no logical reason for him to physically force his own plane to crash into the ground. And it wasn't until a senior medical pathologist named Dr. Pierre Mason began conducting the highly detailed physical autopsies on the flight crew that the entire impossible mystery finally unraveled. Dr. Mason stood inside the cold, brightly lit morgue, and he placed Captain Stanley Key's heart on a heavy steel medical scale. And he took a small, sharp scalpel and he meticulously sliced open the thick coronary arteries surrounding the muscle. And right inside the main artery, he found a massive, severely advanced buildup of atherosclerotic plaque. And directly underneath that thick plaque, he found a fresh, violently ruptured blood vessel. And Dr. Mason immediately picked up the heavy rotary phone in the morgue and called the lead AAIB investigators. Because the fresh hemorrhage inside the main artery definitively proved that Captain Key had suffered a massive, completely incapacitating heart attack right in the middle of the flight. And based on the specific medical timeline of the hemorrhage and the exact timestamps on the flight data recorder, investigators were finally able to reconstruct the exact physical sequence of events inside that quiet cockpit. The massive plane is slowly climbing through 1,500 feet. The cockpit is completely silent. Stanley reaches his heavy hand down toward the center console to pull the flap lever. But right as his fingers firmly close around the metal handle, the massive blood vessel inside his heart violently bursts. And the sudden, absolutely blinding pain causes his arm to heavily jerk backward, pulling the flap lever far too early. And as the massive pain completely overtakes his chest, his vision goes dark. And his heavy 51-year-old body completely collapses forward, slumping directly over the heavy control column. And as his unconscious body weight violently pushes and pulls on the yoke during his dying physical spasms, his hand randomly flails across the center console. And he inadvertently hits the manual override switch, permanently dumping the air from the stick pusher system. And the plane's nose suddenly pitches completely upward, and the heavy deafening stall alarms immediately start screaming inside the tiny cabin. But there were two other fully trained, highly capable commercial pilots sitting directly next to him. Jeremy Keeley and Simon Ticehurst both had their own set of fully functioning physical controls right in front of their seats. All they had to do to save the entire plane was simply grab their own yoke, physically push it forward to regain speed and fly the plane themselves. But if you recall that furious, red-faced, screaming argument over the union strike in the staff break room just an hour before boarding, that violently aggressive argument had created a rigid, heavily oppressive psychological hierarchy in the cockpit before the engines even started. It had actively established an absolute terrifying dictatorship where the junior officers were completely forbidden from questioning the captain. So when the massive alarms suddenly started blaring, the young 22-year-old first officer was completely paralyzed by his own internal fear of the captain. He was sitting right next to an angry, highly aggressive veteran who was suddenly slumped heavily over the controls. And Jeremy simply did not know what was happening. And he was simply too heavily intimidated by the strict, unforgiving military culture to physically grab his own controls and forcefully wrestle the dying captain off the yoke. He didn't want to overstep his rank. He didn't want to make an unauthorized input. So Jeremy simply kept his hands firmly in his lap. And he just sat there in the right seat listening to the deafening screaming alarms, waiting for orders from a dead man that would never come. And he completely waited until the massive plane hit the ground. 118 people died in the Staines Air disaster, and the massive, undeniable psychological reality of this crash completely revolutionized the entire global aviation industry. It directly forced airlines all over the world to permanently invent and mandate crew resource management. This legally eliminated the absolute dictatorship of the captain, aggressively forcing junior pilots to forcefully speak up and take physical control of the aircraft if they ever see a dangerous mistake being made. And while the rigid, heavily oppressive obedience to authority in a quiet cockpit directly caused a massive jet to fall completely out of the sky, sometimes a person's absolute rigid adherence to polite manners and proper aristocratic etiquette is the exact psychological weapon they use to survive being buried alive in a subterranean cage. On the morning of January 8th, 1971, 56-year-old Sir Jeffrey Jackson was standing inside the massive master bedroom of his official residence in Montevideo, Uruguay. And Jeffrey was a man who lived his entire life adhering to an absolute, heavily rigid British tradition. He was the official British ambassador to Uruguay, and he took his diplomatic position incredibly seriously. He was not the kind of man who would ever be caught wearing a wrinkled shirt, leaning against a wall, or speaking out of turn. Every single morning, he would wake up at the exact same early hour. He would shave using a heavy straight razor, he would meticulously comb his hair, and he would put on a perfectly tailored heavy wool suit, complete with a pocket square, a tightly fitted vest, and a perfectly knotted silk tie. And he did this every single day, despite the fact that it was the middle of the extremely humid, incredibly hot South American summer. Because to Jeffrey, maintaining the appearance of a proper English gentleman was an absolute unyielding duty to his country. And right around 9 o'clock in the morning, Jeffrey walked out the front door of his massive residence, nodded politely to his security detail, and climbed into the back seat of his dark blue official embassy vehicle. And his driver, a local Uruguayan man who had worked for the embassy for years, started the heavy engine and began the completely routine standard drive through the crowded, noisy streets of Montevideo toward the main British embassy building. And Jeffrey just sat in the back leather seat quietly reading through a massive stack of morning newspapers and reviewing his highly structured daily schedule. Now, in 1971, the political climate in Uruguay was highly volatile and deeply divided. The country was actively dealing with a massive, highly organized group of urban communist guerrillas known as the Tupamaros. And these specific guerrillas were not hiding out in the distant jungles or rural mountains. They were highly educated college students, former bank managers, and militant professionals living directly in the capital city. And they actively funded their political revolution by robbing heavy banks, stealing massive weapons shipments, and aggressively kidnapping high-profile foreign diplomats for massive cash ransoms. But the British government had a very strict, completely uncompromising foreign policy. They absolutely refused to negotiate with terrorists, and they completely refused to pay any ransom money or release any prisoners under any circumstances. And Jeffrey knew this strict policy perfectly well. He knew that if he was ever taken, he would be completely on his own. So as his dark blue car slowly turned down a narrow one-way street, just a few blocks away from the embassy, the driver suddenly slammed his foot on the heavy brakes. Because a large, slow-moving delivery truck had abruptly pulled out of a blind alleyway and completely blocked the entire road forward. And the driver immediately looked in his rearview mirror to throw the car into reverse and back out of the street. But a second heavy vehicle had already pulled up directly behind their rear bumper, completely boxing them in. And before Jeffrey could even ask what was happening, the doors of the surrounding cars in the delivery truck violently flew open. And over a dozen young men and women wearing thick wool ski masks poured out into the narrow street. They were carrying heavy submachine guns, long hunting rifles, and thick metal pipes, and they completely swarmed the ambassador's car. One of the masked men stepped up to the driver's side window and aggressively smashed the glass with the heavy steel barrel of his weapon. He reached his hand inside, unlocked the heavy doors, and violently dragged the screaming driver out onto the hard pavement. And two other heavily armed men ripped open the rear doors, grabbed Jeffrey by the shoulders of his expensive tailored suit, and physically pulled him out of the back seat. "Do not make a sound. Get in the van. I am the British ambassador. You are making a mistake. We know exactly who you are. Move right now." And they completely ignored his diplomatic immunity. They aggressively shoved him into the back of a waiting panel van. They forced him down flat onto the dirty metal floorboards, and they wrapped a thick, filthy piece of cloth completely around his head, heavily blindfolding him. And the van aggressively sped away into the dense morning city traffic. And for the next several hours, Jeffrey was constantly transferred between multiple different vehicles to completely disorient him. He was shoved into the tight trunks of small sedans. He was driven for miles down incredibly bumpy dirt roads, and he was physically carried down steep, incredibly narrow flights of concrete stairs. And finally, the heavy blindfold was violently pulled off his face. And Jeffrey was standing completely underground. The air was incredibly damp, extremely cold, and smelled heavily of wet earth and raw sewage. And he was standing inside a massive, highly fortified subterranean bunker that the Tupamaros specifically called the People's Prison. And the guerrillas had spent months secretly digging this massive network of tunnels directly underneath the bustling streets of Montevideo. And the specific cell they put Jeffrey inside was not a normal prison room with solid concrete walls and a metal door. It was an extremely small, heavy wire mesh cage that was physically suspended inside a larger underground cavern. The cage was roughly 6 feet long and 4 feet wide. It barely had enough room for a small, extremely thin foam mattress on the damp floor and a cheap plastic bucket in the corner, and a single, completely bare light bulb hung from the low dirt ceiling just a few inches above his head. And the Tupamaros intentionally left that extremely bright light bulb turned on 24 hours a day, because this specific underground cage was heavily designed for maximum psychological warfare. The wire mesh walls meant that Jeffrey had absolutely zero privacy. Heavily armed guards wearing dark hoods stood directly outside the wire, actively watching every single move he made. 24 hours a day. They watched him sleep, they watched him eat, and they watched him use the plastic bucket. The constant light and the constant staring were specifically engineered to cause extreme sleep deprivation and total mental collapse. Now, up on the surface, the kidnapping triggered an absolute massive crisis. The Tupamaros immediately issued their massive political demands to the public press. They aggressively stated that they would physically execute the British ambassador unless the Uruguayan government released over 100 highly radical political prisoners who were being held in maximum security jails. But just as Jeffrey expected, the British government immediately held a major press conference in London and completely refused to negotiate. And the Uruguayan government, unwilling to show weakness completely, refused to release a single prisoner. Instead, the local police launched a massive, violently aggressive manhunt. They kicked down the doors of hundreds of apartments. They set up massive roadblocks across the city, and they swept through the neighborhoods with heavily armed soldiers. But they had absolutely no idea that the man they were looking for was buried completely beneath their feet. So Jeffrey was completely trapped. And the guerrillas actively operated under a massive, unyielding assumption regarding their new high-profile hostage. They looked at his expensive tailored suit, his polished leather shoes, and his privileged aristocratic background, and they completely assumed he was incredibly soft. They heavily believed that a pampered, wealthy diplomat who was completely used to sleeping in luxury hotels, attending fine banquets, and having servants pour his tea, would physically and mentally completely collapse after just a few short days of living in a damp, filthy wire cage underground. They fully expected him to break down crying, beg for his life, suffer a massive nervous breakdown, and actively plead with his government on tape to pay the ransom. But Jeffrey Jackson did absolutely none of those things. Because the Tupamaros did not understand the specific, highly rigid psychological makeup of a career British diplomat who had lived through the heavy bombings of World War II, Jeffrey fully realized that he had absolutely no physical control over his environment. He could not physically fight his way past a dozen heavily armed guards. He could not dig his way out of a deep subterranean bunker with his bare hands. The only thing he could physically control was his own mind, his own attitude, and his own absolute standard of behavior. So Jeffrey actively decided to treat his tiny damp wire cage exactly as if it were a high-end office in the British Embassy. And he began an incredibly strict, heavily regimented daily routine to aggressively maintain his sanity. Every single morning, he would wake up at the exact same time. He would carefully fold his thin, dirty blanket, and he would stand up completely straight inside the cramped cage. And he would meticulously clean himself using just a tiny metal cup of cold water and a small piece of rough, cheap soap. And even though he was completely underground in the dark and he was sweating heavily in the damp, stagnant heat, he flatly refused to stop wearing his formal clothing. But because he obviously did not have a heavy iron to press his trousers, he developed a highly specific physical method. Every single night, before he went to sleep, he would take off his suit pants, perfectly align the fabric creases, and place them completely flat underneath his thin foam mattress, so the heavy weight of his own body would actively press the wrinkles completely out of the fabric while he slept. And the heavily armed guards standing outside the wire mesh were completely bewildered. They were expecting a broken, crying, highly pathetic hostage. Instead, they were watching a man who actively insisted on maintaining absolute aristocratic decorum while sleeping in the dirt and using a plastic bucket for a toilet. And Jeffrey began to actively engage the guards. But he didn't scream at them, he didn't insult them, and he absolutely didn't beg them for his freedom. He spoke to them with extreme, almost aggressive politeness. When they slid a small metal plate of cold rice and beans under the wire mesh, he would formally thank them and eat the terrible food with perfect table manners. When they changed the heavily armed guard shifts, he would politely bid them good morning and casually ask about the weather on the surface, speaking to them as if they were his own embassy staff. And to keep his mind perfectly sharp and completely prevent the psychological torture from rotting his brain, Jeffrey spent hours completely ignoring the armed men pointing guns at him. Instead, he found a small piece of dark charcoal on the ground, and he used it to draw massive, highly detailed architectural plans of castles and intricate landscapes completely from memory directly onto the damp dirt walls of his underground bunker. He would sit on his mattress for hours, quietly lecturing himself out loud on European history, classic literature, and complex philosophical theories. And after several months of this intense, completely unyielding routine, the absolute psychological dynamic completely shifted. If you recall his incredibly strict adherence to British aristocratic etiquette tea time and perfectly folded clothes, that completely rigid, highly formal politeness was the exact psychological weapon that broke his captors and completely dismantled their authority. Because the young, highly radical Tupamaros were mostly college students who thought they were fighting a completely evil, highly corrupt, faceless capitalist empire. But the man sitting inside their wire cage was so undeniably human, so incredibly dignified, and so genuinely highly intelligent that they physically could not hate him anymore. The guards actually started bringing small wooden stools and sitting right next to the wire mesh just to listen to him speak. They put their heavy weapons down. They started asking him complex questions about international politics, heavy economic theory, and the philosophy of the French Revolution. And Jeffrey would sit on his thin mattress, calmly drinking a small metal cup of hot water as if it were fine English tea, and he would aggressively debate the heavily armed terrorists. He would politely point out the massive logical flaws in their revolutionary manifestos. He would politely challenge their political views on violence, and he would completely dismantle their arguments using calm, highly educated, completely rational reasoning. And the Tupamaros were completely fascinated by him. They eventually stopped treating him like a political hostage and actively started treating him like a highly respected university professor. They started sneaking him extra portions of food. They brought him heavy books to read. They brought him fresh clothes and medicine. The young, radical men who were actively threatening to execute him just a few months prior were now politely asking him for personal life advice and political guidance through the heavy wire mesh. The ambassador had completely conquered the people's prison without throwing a single punch. And this completely bizarre, heavily psychological standoff continued for an absolutely staggering 244 days. For 8 full months, Jeffrey Jackson lived inside a tiny wire cage buried deep underground, continuously out-debating and outclassing the men who held his life in their hands. And by September of 1971, the political situation on the surface completely exploded. The Tupamaros executed a massive, heavily coordinated prison break at a highly secure government facility, successfully tunneling into the jail and freeing over 100 of their captured political allies in a single night. And because they had successfully freed their own people without the government's permission, they technically no longer needed to hold the British ambassador as leverage. But more importantly, the specific guerrilla commanders running the underground prison had developed such a massive, profound respect for Jeffrey's unbreakable resilience that they actively refused to harm him, even though their revolution was becoming increasingly violent. So, on September 9th, 1971, the armed guards walked up to the heavy wire cage, and they unlocked the heavy padlock. "It is time to go, sir." "Am I being transferred to another location?" "No. You are going home." And they blindfolded him one last time. They led him up the steep concrete stairs, put him into the back of a small car, and drove him to a quiet, completely empty street in the middle of Montevideo. They stopped the car, they opened the door, and they politely helped him step out onto the pavement. and they drove completely away. And Jeffrey took the heavy blindfold off. He was standing completely alone on the street in the early evening. He was heavily malnourished, he had lost a massive amount of weight, and his skin was completely pale from 8 full months of living entirely underground without seeing the sun. But his mind was completely intact. He calmly walked to a nearby hospital, identified himself to the shocked nurses, and was immediately flown back to the United Kingdom to be reunited with his highly relieved family. Jeffrey Jackson survived one of the longest, most psychologically grueling political kidnappings in modern history, without sustaining a single physical injury. And a few years after he was released, he sat down and wrote a massive, highly detailed memoir titled People's Prison, where he meticulously documented his 244 days in the subterranean cage definitively, proving that the absolute refusal to abandon your own personal standards can be the strongest armor you possess. And while aggressively maintaining polite manners and a strict daily routine is exactly what saved a man from being murdered by heavily armed radicals underground, sometimes the exact opposite happens. Sometimes heavily armed authorities step in to actively save a group of hostages, but their total lack of planning and absolute absence of communication simply turns the rescue mission into a massive, heavily televised slaughter. On the late evening of September 4th, 1972, a large group of athletes from the Israeli national team were walking together through the busy streets of Munich, West Germany. And the athletes were in incredibly high spirits because they were currently competing in the Munich Summer Olympics, and they had just spent their evening off watching a live theater performance of Fiddler on the Roof in the city center. And they were heading back to the Olympic Village to get some sleep before their heavy training schedules the next morning. Now, the German organizing committee had made a very specific, highly intentional decision regarding the physical security of the entire Olympic Village. Because the last time Germany had hosted the Olympics was in 1936, under a highly militarized, deeply oppressive regime. And the German government in 1972 desperately wanted to erase that heavy historical image. They wanted to project an atmosphere of total peace, openness, and extreme hospitality to the entire world. So, they designed the Olympic Village to be completely relaxed. There were absolutely no heavily armed military guards patrolling the streets, there were no heavy concrete barricades, and there were no metal detectors. The local security personnel were strictly unarmed volunteers who were dressed in light pastel blue blazers, and the entire perimeter of the massive residential village was just a standard 6-foot chain-link fence. And athletes from all over the world routinely snuck out of the village at night to go drinking in the city. And when they came back late, they would just toss their bags over the chain-link fence and physically climb over it. And the unarmed security guards in the blue blazers would literally just stand there and watch them do it, occasionally smiling and waving at them. The security was completely intentionally non-existent. And right around midnight, the Israeli athletes arrived back at the village. They walked through the quiet, beautifully landscaped concrete pathways and approached their specific residential building, which was located at Connollystrasse 31. The team was divided into several different ground floor apartments. The wrestling coaches, the heavy weightlifters, and the track athletes all walked into their respective rooms, locked their front doors, and went completely to sleep. And the village went completely quiet. The only sound was the low hum of the massive stadium lights in the distance and the wind blowing through the decorative flag. But at exactly 4:30 in the morning, the quiet atmosphere at the perimeter fence was completely broken. 8 men wearing casual athletic tracksuits walked up to the chain-link fence in the dark. And these men looked exactly like normal international athletes returning from a late night out, except they were carrying extremely heavy, overstuffed canvas duffel bags. And as these 8 men started climbing over the fence, a small group of American athletes actually walked up to the fence at the exact same time. And the Americans casually helped the 8 men lift their heavy duffel bags over the metal wire, completely assuming they were just helping fellow competitors sneak back into the village. They had absolutely no idea that the heavy canvas bags were completely packed with loaded Kalashnikov assault rifles, heavy submachine guns, and dozens of hand grenades. The 8 men dropped down onto the grass inside the village, and they did not hesitate or look around for directions. They immediately walked with absolute rigid purpose straight toward Connollystrasse 31. Because these men were not athletes. They were heavily armed members of a highly militant Palestinian faction known as Black September. And they had spent months meticulously studying the exact architectural blueprints of the Olympic Village, and they knew exactly which specific apartment doors the Israeli team was sleeping behind. The men walked up to the front entrance of apartment 1, and the leader of the group pulled a set of stolen skeleton keys out of his pocket. He quietly slid the heavy metal key into the lock and slowly turned it. Inside the dark apartment, a massive, heavily built Israeli wrestling referee named Yosef Gutfreund was sleeping in a bed right near the front hallway. And Yosef was a very light sleeper. He heard a very faint, metallic scratching sound coming directly from the front door. So he sat up in bed, rubbed his eyes, and walked out into the dark hallway to investigate. And as he looked at the front door, he saw the heavy brass handle slowly start to turn, and the door cracked open just a few inches. And the ambient light from the street illuminated the dark hallway, revealing the cold steel barrel of a submachine gun poking directly through the crack in the door. Yosef immediately realized exactly what was happening. He was a massively strong man, weighing nearly 290 pounds, and he threw his entire physical body weight violently against the heavy wooden door, slamming it shut on the barrel of the gun. And he yelled at the top of his lungs, waking up the other athletes in the apartment. "Get out! Jump out the windows right now!" And the heavy men on the other side of the door aggressively pushed back. The physical struggle was completely desperate. Yosef's massive boots were heavily slipping on the polished floor as he tried to hold the heavy wooden frame closed. And his warning gave several of his teammates just enough time to physically smash the glass of the rear windows and run completely out into the dark courtyard. But there were simply too many attackers. The heavily armed terrorists violently forced the door open, physically throwing Yosef completely backward onto the floor. And the armed men poured directly into the small apartment, aggressively racking the charging handles of their assault rifles and completely taking control of the room. And a second Israeli athlete, a highly trained weightlifter named Yosef Romano, heavily refused to surrender. He grabbed a small, sharp kitchen knife from the counter and aggressively lunged at the leader of the terrorists. And Romano actually managed to physically grab the man's rifle, wrestling it away from him for a brief second. But another terrorist standing in the doorway simply raised his weapon and fired a heavy burst of bullets directly into Romano's chest. Romano collapsed heavily onto the floor, bleeding completely out onto the carpet, and he died just a few minutes later, right in front of his tied-up teammates. The terrorists then aggressively moved down the hall, kicking open the doors to the other bedrooms and dragging the remaining athletes out into the central living room. They severely beat several of the men with the heavy wooden stocks of their rifles, breaking their noses and ribs, completely forcing them into total submission. By 5 o'clock in the morning, the violent breach was completely over. 2 Israeli athletes were dead on the floor, and 9 others were sitting completely tied up in a tight circle in the center of the living room, surrounded by 8 men holding loaded assault rifles. And as the sun slowly came up over Munich, a young cleaning woman walking past Connollystrasse 31 saw the shattered glass and the thick blood on the pavement outside the door. And she immediately ran to find an unarmed security guard. And within 30 minutes, the local Munich police completely surrounded the apartment block. And the leader of the terrorists, a man who called himself Isa, opened the front door just a few inches. And he tossed a single piece of crumpled paper out onto the sidewalk. A German police officer carefully walked up, picked up the paper, and read it. The paper contained a highly specific, completely uncompromising set of demands. The terrorists demanded the immediate, unconditional release of 234 Palestinian prisoners who were currently being held in maximum security jails in Israel, and they demanded safe passage out of West Germany. And they stated that if their demands were not completely met by 9 o'clock that morning, they would begin physically executing one tied-up athlete every single hour, and they would throw their bodies out the front door for the television cameras to see. And the entire German government was completely thrown into an absolute state of massive panic. The Munich police chief, a man named Manfred Schreiber, immediately drove to the Olympic Village to take total command of the situation. But Schreiber and the entire German police force were actively operating under a completely false, highly dangerous assumption regarding this crisis. They heavily assumed that they could treat heavily armed, politically motivated international terrorists exactly the same way they treated local domestic bank robbers. They completely believed they could just wait them out, negotiate slowly, and eventually force them to surrender. And this massive assumption was entirely rooted in a massive structural failure. In 1972, the German police did absolutely not have a specialized, highly trained tactical counterterrorism unit. They had absolutely no hostage rescue teams, no heavy body armor, and no specialized military snipers. They were just regular beat patrol police officers holding standard handguns. So Schreiber began stalling for time. He stood in the hallway outside the apartment and actively negotiated with Issa, completely begging him to extend the massive deadline. And surprisingly, Issa agreed to push the deadline back several times throughout the incredibly hot afternoon. And while Schreiber was negotiating at the front door, the German police attempted to execute a completely disastrous rescue plan called Operation Sunshine. The police actively gathered a few dozen regular patrol officers, told them to put on standard athletic sweatpants so they would blend in, and handed them heavy submachine guns. And they ordered these officers to climb up onto the flat concrete roof of the apartment building, physically crawl to the edge, and prepare to rappel down and smash through the windows. But the entire operation was a complete massive failure before it even started, because the global media had completely descended on the Olympic Village. There were massive television cameras broadcasting the entire hostage situation live to over 900 million people around the world. And the television cameras physically zoomed in on the German police officers crawling around on the roof with their guns. And the terrorists sitting inside the apartment simply turned on the television in the living room, and they watched the live broadcast. They watched the exact physical movements of the police officers on the roof right above their heads. Issa immediately walked to the window, opened it slightly, and yelled down at the police negotiators. He told them that if the men on the roof did not immediately back away, he would execute 2 hostages right on the spot. And the German police completely panicked and immediately called off the entire roof assault. The lack of basic media control had completely ruined their only element of physical surprise. By late afternoon, the situation was completely deteriorating. The terrorists were becoming heavily agitated, and the Israeli government had formally and absolutely refused to negotiate or release any prisoners. So the terrorists completely changed their demands. They demanded that the German government provide them with 2 military helicopters to fly them from the Olympic Village to a nearby airbase. And they demanded a massive, fully fueled passenger jet waiting on the tarmac to fly them and the hostages directly to Cairo. And Police Chief Schreiber immediately agreed to this new demand. But he had absolutely no intention of letting them leave the country. He decided to completely abandon the Olympic Village and set up a massive, heavily armed ambush at the Fürstenfeldbruck military air base. And the plan seemed completely straightforward. They would fly the terrorists and the hostages to the dark airbase. They would have a completely empty Boeing 727 passenger jet waiting on the concrete tarmac. And inside the jet, they would place heavily armed German police officers completely disguised as the flight crew. When the terrorist leaders boarded the plane to inspect it, the disguised crew would aggressively shoot them. And simultaneously, a team of police snipers positioned around the dark tarmac would open fire on the remaining terrorists outside the helicopters. But the entire execution of this plan was heavily compromised by massive, completely amateur mistakes. First, the police officers who were specifically chosen to be the snipers were not actually trained military snipers. They were just regular daily patrol cops who happened to shoot standard rifles competitively on the weekends as a hobby. And they were not given heavily scoped, highly accurate sniper rifles. They were just handed standard-issue G3 battle rifles with absolutely no telescopic sights and no infrared night vision. And second, the police commanders placed these 5 men around the dark tarmac, instructing them to hide behind a low concrete wall and up in the heavy control tower. But they did not issue them any 2-way radios. They essentially told them to just wait in the dark and wait for a visual signal from the commanders to start shooting. And the most catastrophic failure happened inside the decoy plane. A team of heavily armed German police officers walked onto the Boeing 727 wearing standard pilot uniforms. But as they sat in the dark cabin waiting for the helicopters to arrive, they started talking to each other. They actively realized that they were sitting in a highly confined metal tube armed only with handguns, preparing to engage heavily armed terrorists carrying assault rifles and hand grenades. The police officers took a completely unauthorized internal vote right there in the cabin, and they unanimously, completely voted to abandon the mission. They simply stood up, walked completely off the plane, and went home, leaving the massive decoy aircraft completely, entirely empty. And they did not tell the commanders or the snipers outside that they had left. At exactly 10:30 at night, the heavy thumping sound of 2 massive Bell UH-1 military helicopters echoed across the dark airbase. The helicopters slowly descended out of the night sky and landed on the brightly lit concrete tarmac right near the completely empty Boeing jet. The heavy sliding doors of the helicopters opened, and the terrorists stepped out onto the concrete holding their heavy rifles. The 9 Israeli hostages were completely tied up, heavily blindfolded, and physically chained to the internal metal seats of the 2 helicopters. Issa and his second in command, a man named Tony, left the helicopters and walked across the tarmac to completely inspect the waiting passenger jet. They climbed the metal stairs, walked through the open door, and stepped into the cabin. And they immediately realized the plane was completely dark and entirely empty. There was no pilot, there was no crew, and the engines were completely silent. Issa instantly realized the entire transfer was a massive, heavily coordinated trap. He yelled to Tony, and the 2 men turned around and sprinted completely down the metal stairs, running aggressively back across the open tarmac toward the helicopters and the hostages. And the German police commanders sitting in the control tower panicked. They realized the decoy crew had abandoned the plane and the trap had completely failed. So they yelled a direct order to the 5 snipers to open fire immediately. And the snipers raised their standard rifles, looked through their basic iron sights, and pulled the triggers. But because the snipers had absolutely no two-way radios, they had no idea the decoy crew had completely abandoned the plane. And they had no idea the terrorists were actively running back to execute the hostages. They were completely disconnected from the command center, just staring through the dark. And when the order to fire was given, the snipers were completely uncoordinated. They didn't know which specific target they were supposed to shoot at. The first volley of heavy gunfire completely missed Issa and Tony. The heavy bullets sparked violently against the concrete tarmac, and the terrorists immediately returned fire. They raised their Kalashnikovs and sprayed hundreds of heavy rounds completely into the dark, violently shooting at the control tower and the low concrete walls. A massive, entirely chaotic firefight completely erupted across the entire airbase. The snipers were shooting blindly into the shadows, and because they had no radios, they actually started accidentally firing directly toward each other's positions. And the 9 tied-up Israeli hostages were completely trapped inside the thin metal bodies of the helicopters, heavily chained to the seats, completely unable to move while thousands of heavy bullets ripped through the air around them. The heavy firefight lasted for over an hour. The German commanders desperately called for heavy armored vehicles to drive onto the tarmac and physically shield the helicopters. But the armored cars completely got stuck in massive traffic jams, caused by thousands of curious civilians who had driven out to the airbase to watch the standoff. And by midnight, the terrorists realized they were completely surrounded and had absolutely no way to escape, and they made a final, completely ruthless decision. One of the terrorists stood up from his hiding spot, walked directly up to the open door of the first helicopter, and raised his heavy assault rifle. He fired a massive, continuous burst of bullets completely at point-blank range, directly into the tied-up athlete. And then he pulled the heavy metal pin from a high-explosive hand grenade, tossed it directly into the cabin, and ran away. The massive explosion physically lifted the heavy helicopter completely off the ground. The fuel tanks ruptured, and a massive column of bright orange fire shot completely up into the night sky, instantly incinerating everyone inside. Seconds later, another terrorist walked up to the second helicopter and actively executed the remaining tied-up hostages with his rifle before the German snipers finally shot him dead. When the heavy smoke finally cleared the next morning, the absolute undeniable reality of the massive failure was completely exposed to the world. All 9 of the Israeli hostages were completely dead. 1 German police officer had been shot and killed in the crossfire, and 5 of the 8 terrorists were dead, with the remaining 3 taken into custody. The completely horrific, highly televised disaster at Munich fundamentally completely shattered the global illusion of safety. The total, absolute failure of the German police to safely resolve the crisis directly forced the West German government to immediately create GSG-9, which became one of the most elite, highly specialized counterterrorism units on the fire. Entire planet completely changing the way police forces around the world handle hostage situations. And while a massive lack of tactical planning and communication can directly turn a rescue operation into a highly televised tragedy, sometimes a completely different kind of disaster happens when a pilot is too heavily intimidated to bloat. Forcefully